Warning, if what I'm about to show you in this story ever presents itself to you in the wilderness, I promise you it is not a game, it's a trap. So my buddy Bobby hits me up a couple times a year, and when Bobby calls, you always answer. Cause to be honest, my bro Bobby always has the coolest stuff going on, but it's always spur of the moment. But if you're gonna be friends with somebody like him, you have to embrace his spontaneity and you have to jump on the opportunities that he presents you. So this one weekend, a couple months back, I go from sitting on my couch, housing a whole pizza to myself, to answering the phone to Bobby. And this man has me on a plane by the next morning, and in the passenger seat next to him, driving to Mount Hood to check out a couple indigenous sites that he's been researching. Actually, let me clear that up. We weren't exactly going to Mount Hood. We weren't trying to summit a mountain that day. We were actually headed to Mirror Lake, which has a not so difficult hike in an absolutely beautiful area. And the plan wasn't to go directly to one specific indigenous site. What Bobby likes to do is he likes to wander a little bit. He likes to come across maybe some old structures, maybe dig for an artifact here and there. This dude loses it if he finds a boulder with some carvings on it that seem like they're from back in the day. So for the next part of this story to make sense to you, you need to understand what the landscape is around that area. As you start this hike, like I said, it's not so difficult. There is a little bit of a rocky terrain at some points, but as you get closer to the lake, there are large clearings that is mostly grass, and it's just surrounded by clusters of cedar trees and Douglas firs. And these clusters of trees almost make up mini forests. There's just patches of them. And the trail that we were on weaves through these clusters of mini forests, and a full wall of trees that looks like is this entire immense forest ends, and you weave through it, and then there's another cluster right there. So if you walk directly through one, it would probably only take 10-15 minutes to get outside the other end of the cluster and be in another clearing. So we're walking, enjoying ourselves. I hadn't seen my homie in a couple months, so I was pumped to be there. We were catching up. There wasn't another soul in the area. It was a beautiful day, and everything was going beautifully until we came across this cluster of trees that was a little bit different than the rest. It wasn't the color or the size of this mini forest or cluster of trees. It wasn't the type of trees. There was something off inside of the trees. There was a gaping hole in an unnatural section that seemed to be affecting all of the trees around it. It was as if somebody took a Photoshop eraser and toggled the cursor over the wall of trees and clicked it once. And it seemed like the trees that were affected by this unnatural circle were cut at the base by the trunk, but then the rest of the tree continued above the gaping hole, as if the middle part of the tree was simply invisible, or as if it just disappeared. And it's not like there was nothing behind the circle. It's not like there was a black void behind it or a portal or anything like that. You could see the other trees that were behind it. Like, you could tell that there was a deep forest behind this opening, but there was just an unnatural opening. And like I said about these cluster of trees, these mini forests, each mini forest acted like its own little ecosystem, its own entity. So when I'm looking at this thing, the first thing that it reminded me of was like an opening to a birdhouse. And as I was looking at this thing, I had kind of a funny thought. I imagined a bunch of little birds banding together to create this opening into their home to make it easier for them to fly in. That was punched home by the fact that when Bobby and I started getting closer to it, the edge of the circle looked as if vines were bound together to keep it open, but there didn't seem to be anything around the edges of it that were man-made. It almost looked like the forest did it to itself, because the vines that were making the opening looked as if they were connected to the trees, as if the trees were doing it to themselves, creating the opening itself. So obviously this thing is bizarre looking, and we want to get a better look at it, and it's not like it would be much of a risk for us to go up to it. It was only about 100 feet away from us. It was very close to the trail. It was not risky to step off the trail slightly to go look at this bizarre anomaly. It's not like we were going a mile off trail to see this thing. It didn't really matter. So I look at Bobby, and he's over the moon about it. He wants to check this thing out, and that pumped me up. So we start marching over to it. These are the exact kind of things that he goes out looking for. So I'm excited to experience this with him, and we start approaching it. And the closer we got to this thing, the more inviting it was. I couldn't tell if it was some type of abstract art project or just nature's divine beauty, capable of incredible things, but I just wanted to get the closest look that I could. Everything about this thing was compelling, and I just wanted wanted to get up to it and get my hands on it. Or better yet, take a peek inside. So we get up to this thing and we both slap our hands on these thick vines that are weaved together. And this thing was impressive. It was incredible. The vines that were bound together was almost as thick as those ropes that they would hang from gym ceilings. And we both put our weight on our hands and leaned over to look around. We just stuck our heads in just to get a better look, see what was going on the inside. And once we put our heads in, we realized what this thing actually was. This wasn't a fun art project. This wasn't an opening for a Thunderbird's house. People made this, and people were living in here. We were looking at what seemed to be a small village hidden inside one of these clusters of trees. And to be honest, I don't know if I could say hidden because of this gaping hole in one of their tree lines. But if you weren't looking through this gaping hole, you wouldn't be able to see any of the buildings or any of the structures or any of the people on the inside of this forest. So in a way, it was kind of hidden. So the first thing that we notice about this place is there are a couple of cabins. There's some structures in there. But the second thing that we notice is that there's currently a gathering going on in the middle of this little village. And from the looks of it, us being about 50 yards away, this seemed to be a very serious gathering. There was about 20 people sitting on a makeshift set of bleachers with another man standing in front of them at a podium speaking to them. And it seemed as if he was giving a speech and he was reading off note cards to these people and putting down a note card every couple seconds. We couldn't hear what they were saying because we were out of earshot, but it was very clear that the people that were sitting on the bleachers did not like the last thing he said on that last note card that he had. And once he put down that last note card, a major commotion erupted. One woman in particular, who seemed to be in her mid-20s, stood up and was aggressive. She was upset. She popped up off these bleachers and turned around and started berating three women who seemed to be desperately apologizing to her. And Bobby and I look at each other and we're like, should we mind our own business here? Like, we're in the middle of nowhere. That's not really our problem. And it's definitely not smart to get into other people's business out here, especially if this is where they live. Like, we're basically trespassing, even though they're probably illegally staying in this national park. It is not our job to police them. Everything in us wanted to explore past this hole in these trees, but with this commotion going on, just didn't seem like the right thing to do. But we did proceed to duck down and listen very closely at what was going on, because now they were shouting. We could hear them at this point, and even though it wasn't our problem, the best form of entertainment is drama. I'm not going to act like it isn't, and we were interested in the tea. And I said that very jokingly. Everything was fun and games until it started to get violent. You see, it's one thing if people are having an argument, and a couple women are having a disagreement, maybe they're fighting. You're usually better off just letting them resolve it inside of their community. But that changes when you see a man put his hands on a woman. You can't sit by and allow it to happen. In fact, if you see a group of men put their hands on a woman, even if you're in the middle of nowhere, even if it isn't your community, it is not okay to stand by and let it happen. Even if it was very clear that this said woman stood up off the bleachers and started the altercation, you can't sit back and watch a woman get dragged by her feet by multiple men into the woods. This woman is fighting back for her life. She's digging her nails into the dirt. She's freaking out. She's yelling. She's trying to get people's help, people's attention. And we have to make that decision in that moment. We pull back for a second. We look at each other because we don't want to jump in too early, but we also can't wait too long that she actually gets some bodily harm. There's a fine balance of taking action, and we had to decide when we were going to step in. The reality of the situation is that Bobby and I were both armed, but another harsh reality of the situation was that there was probably multiple men in there that were also armed. So if we were going to step in and end this altercation, we were going to need to have the jump on these guys. We needed to have weapons out and ready, and we were going to have to sneak up on them. So we take them out, we high step through the circle in the trees, and we start circling around trying to get a good angle on this group of guys. So we start fading off to our right in an attempt to flank them, and we're just watching to see what they're gonna do next. Because best case scenario is that this situation de-escalates and we can approach them civilly, just to make sure everything's good moving forward. But we could put our firearms away and not make an altercation bigger than it already is. But instead, the worst case scenario happens. And it happens as we're circling this odd village in this odd cluster of trees. We watch these guys take an animal control pole, similar to the ones that they catch stray dogs with. You know, the pole that has the leash at the end that you tighten from the other end of the pole around stray dogs' necks? They took that pole and they wrapped it around the girl's hands as if they were handcuffs, and then they were controlling her from behind with a long pole and walking her towards the woods. 3 men were holding the pole so she couldn't get away. She was trying to squirm, she was trying to release herself from it, but her hands were bound behind her back and the pole was pressed into her lower back, walking her in the direction that they wanted to. And not only are these 3 men holding onto this pole to wrangle this poor woman, the rest of the people that were sitting on the bleachers, acting as if they were civilians, picked up torches that were also on a pole and surrounded this girl in like a half circle, reaching their torches towards her so she wouldn't be able to go back and forth or to try to create a better angle against the people that were holding the pole behind her. The entire group was conspiring to push her in one direction. And for a minute, we can't see where they're exactly leading her. Because of our angle, there's some trees in the way, we were looking over people's shoulders. We could just see the general shape of the group and the general direction that they were taking her. And it seemed as if they were just walking her into a denser area of the woods. Because they were clearly walking away from the village section of this cluster of trees, but it was looking like some type of weird, sick ritual. And Bobby and I are genuinely scared at this moment because there's 20 of these people. But when you're in that type of situation, you start to notice the minute details. And the detail that you tend to focus on, especially in a situation like this, is do they have firearms? And there were no holsters in sight. Everybody seemed to have some type of torture stick or some type of melee weapon, but I didn't see any guns. There were no rifles leaning up against trees. If there were any firearms here, they must have been in one of the surrounding buildings, but we were in between them and the buildings. So if we had to confront them, it was more than likely that they were gonna have to surrender to us. But it's hard to tell if somebody has something tucked away in a belly band or something. So internally, Bobby and I are just praying that whatever sick thing that they're doing just stops and we don't have to make it this horrible confrontation. But the girl that's bound to this pole is still violently screaming. And the only person that was talking back to her was the man that was standing at the podium. And this man was also holding onto the pole. He was the closest person to her, restraining her. He was actively a part of this. But he was the only one talking back to her. And she's screaming at the top of her lungs, freaking out, saying that they lied to her. But this dude is replying to her, saying things along the lines of, "You're ready for this." So at that moment, I know that this has to be some type of cruel, cult-like ritual. And it was clear that the man that was standing at the podium attempted to brainwash this girl to make her think that she was ready for what was about to happen to her. And everybody else around her had clearly already drinking the Kool-Aid, and they were all on this man's side. So we have no choice but to barrel towards this group of people, guns drawn, and confront them before anything worse happens. I had a pit in my throat and a hole in my chest, and there was no way that I was going to be able to enunciate properly and intimidate these guys. I'd never held anybody at gunpoint before. I'd never demanded for somebody to disarm themselves. I didn't even know what to say. Do I say something corny like, "Hey, put your hands up"? Do I try to be aggressive? Do I try to be cold and calm and collected? "Hey, put your hands up." Like, what in this situation is more intimidating so we could properly take control of it? I didn't know because I hadn't had the proper training that Bobby had. And I know my way around a firearm, but in no way do I know how to handle a situation like this. We're only a couple feet away from this group at this point, and the commotion that they're making is loud enough that they don't even hear us approaching. So we're gonna have to say something to get their attention so they know that we're here to stop them. And I'm just focusing on trying to keep a stance, professional looking enough that they'll respect me and they'll actually drop their weapons. But I felt like if I tried to speak, my voice would crack and I would embarrass myself like I was a little kid trying to talk back to my mom, fighting back tears. And they wouldn't respect the fact that we were here to end whatever they were doing. But instead of hearing my 6-year-old voice having a tantrum, I heard Bobby's voice speak up, and the tone of his voice was different than anything that I've ever heard come out of his mouth before. You see, Bobby was in the National Guard before he was on the fire department, but I didn't know they trained people in the National Guard for situations like this. So I felt like he was as unprepared as I was for this situation, but that was a naive thought of mine because he knew exactly what to do. He made very clear demands to the group before they had even turned around. He spoke in a tone of voice that was deep and demanding, but it wasn't aggressive or violent, but his message got across perfectly. He meant business. He very firmly said, "Torches on the ground, hands in the air, and everybody on their knees." Very brief, very stern, and very clear. And the entire group that was banding together to restrain this girl turned towards us in utter panic. I don't know why they thought they would get away with this, and I also don't know why they were surprised that somebody caught them. The trail that we were walking on, even though there wasn't anybody around us, it was pretty popular. So them making this much noise, it was very likely anybody that was walking by would see and hear what they were doing. But these people were looking at us like we were aliens from a different planet, like they hadn't seen anybody from outside of their village in years. And the clear ringleader of the group, the dude that was standing at the podium, was looking at us, and I could see in his eyes that he was trying to figure out what he was going to say to us, because he knew nobody else was speaking up. He was the one that was going to have to step forward and explain all of this. And I could tell that he was trying to make a calculated decision to get out of this sticky situation with a little bit of quick wit. But we could see right through him. I could tell that he was going to attempt to say something manipulating to try to make it seem as if we didn't just catch him doing something completely bizarre and not borderline illegal. It was illegal. If we were to categorize this, it would be kidnapping. And his eyes are shooting around. I could see he's searching for the words. He's searching for the sentences, the lies to tell these two armed strangers that see him for what he is and caught him in the act. And Bobby very clearly repeats himself to all of the surrounding individuals. And everybody is listening to Bobby except for this one man, and he won't let go of the pole. And I'm doing my best to seem as hard as possible. I have my bank robber face on, trying to convince this guy that I've done this before. But I don't really know how to handle this situation. The only thing that comes to my mind is to shuffle to my right to get a better angle at the restrained girl to see how I could potentially help her once this dude finally decides to drop this pole. And when I got a better look at this girl, it seemed like she had calmed down a little bit. She wasn't wiggling or screaming as much. She seemed to be either accepting the situation or standing there quietly hoping that we are going to be able to de-escalate it for her. And initially that came off to me a little bit odd, because it seemed as if maybe she was being quiet and settled down because at her core she was trying to protect him and her community. Like, you never know how in deep somebody is, and since there's an outsider catching them, maybe she still feels guilty exposing the people that she had spent so much time with. But I couldn't see her facial expression. I could only see the side of her face, and it seemed as if she was in a deep contemplating thought. But before I was able to talk to her or get her side of the story, just to get a gauge of what was going on here, the man that was still holding the pole, the man at the podium, had came up with the lie that he was going to tell us. And he said in the most desperate voice I've ever heard come out of a man, "I know you boys mean well, but if you try to stop this, you're gonna get all of us killed. I promise I'll explain everything once she's through the gap." And the first thing that runs through my head is, what does this guy mean, the gap? And I initially thought maybe he's talking about the odd entrance that we came through, but that wouldn't make sense because they weren't walking her towards the way we came in. They were walking her towards the woods. So I turned my head back towards the girl to see if there was any landmark behind her that they were taking her to, and there was. And the term that he used, the gap, instantly made sense to me because there was this thing about 5 feet beyond this girl that looked as unnatural as the thing that we came through to get in here. It wasn't a circle in a tree line. It looked like straggly branches coming up from the ground with a slice down the middle, as if you erased the middle of a naked fern bush. And the gap in between these straggly branches was only about 1.5 feet wide. What would usually look like straggly naked bushes looked like an abstract piece of art, like they just deleted the middle. One stripe down the middle separated these two wings of straggly branches, and it was clear that that's what he was referring to because of the gap in the middle of these branches. This entire group was clearly marching this poor girl towards this gap in an attempt to push her through it. And I'm looking at this thing and I'm trying to figure out what is so bad about putting her through the gap, because it's not like they're pushing her off a cliff. I could see the other end of it. It's flat ground, it's the forest. It's literally just 2 patches of straggly branches. If she went through it, literally nothing would happen. And as I'm trying to comprehend what could possibly be the goal here, the man from the podium starts to talk again, and he says in that same desperate voice, "She has to go through it. Guys, I know it doesn't make sense, but she has to go through it. For the sake of all of these people, these innocent people around us, you have to let her walk through that gap. She knows she needs to go through that gap. And if it makes you feel more comfortable, you can go through it with her. And if you can agree to do that, I promise you, everybody's going to be safe here and everybody's going to get through this. But the girl that's attached to the pole that we're trying to save loses it when he says that, and she starts screaming. She starts going, this man is a liar. She's exposing him, freaking out, just calling this dude, the man from the podium, a straight up liar. And she's saying that nobody's going to be okay and for us to not listen to a word that he says. And what happens next unfolded in a blink of an eye. You never know how you're going to react to situations like this. But all of these people, all of the people of this village are on their knees with their hands up listening to us, except for the man from the podium, except for the man with the hands on the pole. And he's just standing there eyeing us. He doesn't seem to be scared of our firearms. He looks like he's willing to risk it. And I could see in his eye the glint of a decision being made, and he turns around and he risks us shooting him in the back to proceed to try to accomplish what he set out to by pushing this girl through that gap. We had no idea what else to do in that situation. We didn't set out to shoot this guy. We didn't want to hurt anybody here. We just wanted to de-escalate it. So we quickly holstered our weapons and ran up to try to get the end of the pole, and both of us got our hands on it. It was clear to us that all of the other people here, other than this guy, were borderline harmless. They were genuinely scared, so this was only an altercation between us two and him, and he was outnumbered. I know what most of you are thinking, that putting away our firearms in that situation is stupid, and you shouldn't even take them out unless you're willing to use them. But we thought we were going to have to because we were outnumbered. But once all of these clear civilians, who were clearly very scared of this whole situation in general, completely gave up and disarmed themselves, we didn't feel like it was a life-threatening situation anymore, and these innocent people were beyond him. They were behind him, so if we unloaded on him, there was a high likelihood that we might hit one of these innocent people. So we had to holster it, and we had to get into this tug-of-war battle with this bizarre lying dude and this deranged girl who's handcuffed to a pole, freaking out even though we're supposed to be saving her. So this situation turned from a hold-up to a game of tug-of-war, but the only issue was that me and Bobby only had about 2 seconds to try to get a grip on the pole and get our footing to tug. So Bobby and I catch up to him, and we manage to get our hands on the pole, but this guy has already built up enough momentum that us holding it is almost making us fall forward, and we weren't able to stop the momentum of pushing this girl through the gap. Before we knew it, she was through it, and we were just holding onto the other end of it. And once the girl passed through the gap, it was as if she fell through a veil and I wasn't able to see her anymore. So I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, because it seemed like she disappeared after she fell through it, and once she was through it, the man from the podium let go of the pole and jumped backwards. But we were determined to try to pull her out of there in an attempt to save her. That's why we're here in general. But we didn't have our footing yet, and we were falling and stumbling forward. And once she went through the veil, it was as if something on the other end grabbed the pole and yanked it so hard that it caused Bobby and I to also fall through the gap. After I passed through the gap, my cheekbone and chin cracked off the dirt, and Bobby basically fell on top of me, cracking his forehead on the back of my head. But even though I was borderline a quarter concussed, I didn't like the feeling of being on the floor with all of these people behind me. Even though they showed me that most of them are mostly harmless, I didn't want them all to pounce on me. I just needed to get back to my feet. I especially didn't want to allow the man that was at the podium to have my back, to come at us with a rock and catch me slipping. So I knew I had to turn around, but when I tried to grasp where he was, try to locate him so I could hone in on him and fight him off if I needed to, no one was there. He wasn't there, the people of the village weren't there, the cabins weren't there, the torches, the campfires. I know I hit my head pretty hard. I hit my face on the ground, and the back of my head got cracked with Bobby's head, but I didn't hit my head so hard that they would have time to run away. I got to my feet pretty quickly. I definitely didn't lose consciousness, and they definitely didn't have time to run off. The only thing that was left there in front of us was the gap that they pushed us through. So I whipped my head towards Bobby, who's clearly as confused as I am, and we both instinctively reached for our firearms, and we were spinning in a 360 circle like a confused toddler, just trying to track down where anybody is, but no one's around us. The only person that's there with us is the girl that we were trying to save. and she doesn't look happy with us. She looks more annoyed with us than the man from the podium who we caught doing something bizarre. She managed to wiggle out of the rope that was handcuffing her from that control pole, and she was standing there looking through her eyebrows with this menacing look on her face as if she hated us. She's not saying anything to us. We don't know what to say to her because our intentions were clearly good, but she's looking at us like we're horrible people, so we're waiting there for her to start talking, but instead of opening dialogue, maybe thanking us, maybe asking us what happened, she just squats down, scoops up a handful of wet dirt and starts rubbing it all over herself. It wasn't quite mud, but it was dirt that was wet enough that if you wiped it on yourself, it would spread, but it wasn't goopy and liquidy. And this girl takes 2 handfuls of this wet dirt and presses it on her face and starts scrubbing and spreading it like she's exfoliating. She proceeds to wipe it all over her arms, all over her legs, the back of her neck, behind her ears, in her armpits, in her pants, in her private areas, her ankles, her feet, and then after that was done, she starts rubbing it on her clothes. And at that point, I realized that this girl might have been exiled from this village for being batshit crazy, because she was completely covered in mud head to toe, scrubbing herself with it like she was Rambo. Her complexion changed. If she went up against a tree, she would have disappeared. And this girl's eyes are telling me that she is beyond paranoid. She's also furiously angry, and that anger has something to do with us. And for some reason, I didn't feel like it was appropriate in that situation to speak loudly. I don't know why. It felt like we were supposed to whisper. It might have had to do with the fact that she was rubbing dirt all over herself in an attempt to camouflage, so maybe subconsciously I thought, if she's trying to camouflage herself, maybe I should be quiet and whisper. And the only thing that I could come up with saying is, "Hey, are you okay?" Thinking that she might reply in a tone that's grateful. You know, considering that we put our tails on the line and confronted the people and ended the situation that she was in. But she replied in the meanest, most dismissive tone. She basically hissed at us, saying, "I lied about him lying, so you two wouldn't be here, but here you are, useless fodder." And for a second, I couldn't get over her intense Boston accent. She sounded like she should have been casted in The Departed 2. She was a straight up Southie. This girl could have been Bill Burr's sister with the way that she sounded. So Bobby and I look at each other with confusing looks, trying to figure out what is the best move moving forward. Like, what are the proper questions that we could ask that she won't be venomously angry about? What gets us closer to the answers that we need to properly handle this situation? And the only thing that Bobby could come up with was, why were they doing that to you? Which I thought was a pretty good question. And this girl dismissively answered his question with something super vague. She said, "Because I lost the vote, and I wouldn't have been so mad if those girls hadn't lied to me. I'm not scared of the gap, I just hate liars." And at this point, this girl is being sassy to us, but she's covered head to toe in mud. She looks ridiculous. Like, I'm dead serious, she looked like she fell into Willy Wonka's chocolate river. And she had the nerve to be talking to us disrespectfully and sarcastically as if we hadn't just stuck our necks out for her. But that didn't change the fact that the other people that were just with us, the people that we had confronted, disappeared. And when I stood up and I walked back through what they were calling the gap, they didn't reappear. I didn't re-enter the village. Nothing happened. I was still in the area with just Bobby and this girl. It's not like the village and the people disappeared and we were still on the outskirts of the village. We were in a different place. The forest seemed similar, but it was much darker. The canopy made the area darker and the terrain was a little bit different. We weren't where we started, but it felt like we were still kinda in the same area. This girl could clearly tell that my head was racing with questions because I was popping in and out of this gap trying to understand what happened. And as these questions are coming to me, she cuts off my train of thought by saying, "It's not there. I promise it's not there. We have to find our way out." And she said it in a slightly kinder, slightly more empathetic tone, as if she was warming up to me a little bit and was empathetic about my confusion. Then she follows up by saying something that raised even more questions in my head. She said, "Where were you when you saw it? The glass. Where were you?" I had no idea what she meant by the glass. We didn't see any type of glass. I didn't know if she meant the gap that the podium man referred to what we just walked through as, but I hadn't heard anybody mention the glass yet. And she could see on my face that I was not recognizing what she was trying to say, so she corrected herself. She cleared things up by saying, "Where did you see the circle where it shouldn't have been?" And for some reason, That sentence, that cluster of words made every single hair on my body stand up. And it wasn't because the entrance to that village was an unnatural circle. It was weird. But the way that she posed the question made it sound bizarre. She asked where we were when we saw it, as if everybody answers something different to that question. And Bobby answered her instead of me, and I could tell by the tone of his voice that what she said didn't register with him. Because what he said was, "Can you take us to Mirror Lake? If you could bring us there, we promise we could get you somewhere safe. Because we're not sure where we are right now." And the empathy completely left her voice. It was only in there for a split second because she replied to Bobby saying, "If you guys don't look like me in the next 2 minutes, I promise I'm leaving you here. Don't question it, don't give me any sass, cover yourself with this or go in the other direction." Bobby naturally started to question her because she was asking us to rub mud all over ourselves, but she quickly cut off his question. And every time he would try to start a sentence, she would talk over him by saying, "Oops." He would start a question and she'd go, "Oops," and not let him do it, as if there was no questions to be asked here. Do what I said and do it now or I am abandoning you. And she did it about 4 to 6 times if I recall correctly, until he realized that an oops is unbeatable, and we reluctantly kneeled down, grabbed some dirt and started rubbing it on our forearms. And she gestured to our faces like, "Don't forget to rub it on your face, and also your private parts are the most important." I had started rubbing the dirt on me. I was listening to her, so I felt like I had the space to ask a simple question just to get a little bit of an answer so I could continue to listen to her. And she gave me a fragment of information. All she said was, "The squids can smell us." She said the squids could smell us. There's no water here. This is making absolutely no sense. But here I am, terrified, covering myself in mud, listening to this woman. And this dirt that I'm rubbing on myself smells horrific. It's like a mixture of rotten eggs and manure. It was borderline nauseating trying to put this mud near my face, but as I tried to find a different patch of mud that didn't smell this way, I couldn't find it. And I couldn't tell if this entire place smelled like this or it was just our section of mud. And once Bobby and I finished covering ourselves head to toe with this stinky dirt, I felt like she owed us some answers. But she tried to give us the bare minimum when she started walking. All she said back to us was, "Try breathing through your nose and make sure you walk slowly so you don't build up a sweat. And if you feel like you are building up a sweat, cover that area with dirt again. Follow me, we need to go this way." She was gesturing for us to go deeper into the woods, away from the gap that we came in through. Part of me wanted to let her leave so Bobby and I could have a private conversation on how we were going to handle this situation. But the other part of me had a gut feeling that this girl was our only hope, even though what she was saying was crazy. The look in her eye wasn't crazy though. I mean, it was a little crazy, but it was like crazy smart, as if she knew exactly what to do in this situation. Like for starters, going through that gap that we just went through and the village disappearing behind us didn't seem like a surprise to her. So just from that, I knew that she had information about where we were that could probably be valuable to us. She knew something about this place that we didn't, so these small things that she was demanding for us to do must hold some weight. I just wanted to talk to Bobby for a second, so I told her that we were going to go take a leak before we got moving. I figured that would be a pretty unproblematic request because she made it seem like we were about to start a fairly long hike, so I didn't see a problem in emptying the tank before we got moving. But when I suggested that we were going to go do that, she went right back to being viciously and venomously mean to us. She made it very clear that she was in charge by withholding some of the information over our heads because she said, "If you want to talk in private, that's fine. If you're going to go drop our scent in the first 2 minutes of being here, at least give me a 5-minute head start to get away from you morons. I'm not trying to die here with you. I tell you to breathe through your nose and to cover up your BO, and the first thing that comes through your empty head is to go take a piss. If you want to chum the water, feel free, but let me get away from you first." And I look at Bobby like, bro, what are we gonna do with this girl? The way she's talking to us is like she's Natiri, we're both Jake Sully, and this is our first time on Pandora. We were both trying to be polite, but it's almost impossible when you're dealing with somebody who's purposely withholding information from you, and then holding that information over your head as if you not knowing it because they're withholding it makes you stupid. So I meet her where she's at and I go, "Hey, Miss Granger, you insufferable no know it all. Why don't you fill the class in on what you know? Instead of acting like you being privy to this information makes you smarter than us. And I could tell that it kind of worked, because sometimes with those rough-nosed East Coast people, you gotta meet them with the banter that they're used to, because it seems to be the only way that they can communicate. Because she replied with more information than we had gotten from her this entire time. And that was exactly what I was looking for, even if it was going to be laced with insults, which it was. She clapped back at me quick. She goes, "Look, Frodo, my name's Heidi, not Hermione. And the only thing I know about this place is that we're stuck here, unless we make it through 2 more gaps. Dr. Doyle is the only person that has made it out of here alive from my heap. And he told me that we can't let these things smell us. To be honest, I don't know what a squid is. I don't know why he calls them squids. All I know is that they're in here somewhere, and if they smell us, we're dead. So let's start walking, let's reapply dirt when you start stinking, and let's breathe through our nose, because I could smell your breath from here." There was nothing much we could say back to that. She seemed to let us know the extent of what she knew. Even though she said my breath stank, which it definitely didn't, it seemed as if she wanted us to come along with her. Even though she was insulting me, it was progress. And it didn't seem like we had many other options, so we just walked with her. There wasn't anything inherently scary about where we were. The only thing was that it just smelled kind of bad. And it was very quiet. But most woods are. But there was this underlying feeling that there was something else there with us. We didn't hear anything out of the ordinary or see anything out of the ordinary for the first 2 hours. We were just hiking one foot after the other, trying to go in the same direction that we had been going. We were trying to not curve. One of the hardest things about it was that we were trying to not hike too fast. And that's hard to do because there's an undertone of despair and fear. You want to pick up the pace, but then you have to convince yourself to walk painfully slow. And Heidi made it extremely clear we were not allowed to pick up the pace. If we started to do it, because she would do it here and there as well, she would make us stop, take a deep breath through our nose, and we would slow the pace down. And she would make us reapply some dirt before we got moving again, just in case we were perspiring. We tried to start a little bit of banter with her, like, what are we looking for? But she didn't know. She said that our best bet was to look for something that resembled the gap that we came through. But she made it very clear that Dr. Doyle's main advice was to stay calm and hide our scent. I was doing my best to breathe through my nose, because honestly, I didn't know if Heidi was lying about my breath to make me feel bad, or if it was actually something that could get us caught up. And after a while, I actually started to relax into the situation as if it wasn't completely bizarre. And I found myself leisurely strolling through a dense forest with a stranger that we just met, covered in mud. But just as I was relaxing, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. It wasn't a major movement. It wasn't a monster stalking us or a person charging us. It looked like something popped out of a tree about 30 yards away from us. And I don't mean I saw a creature or an object moving. It almost looked like a liquid shot out of a tree. Like somebody turned on a water fountain for a split second, so there was a small spout of some type of liquid and then it stopped, but you were able to hear it hit the floor. And it sounded like liquid hitting the floor. And it looked like that liquid spout out of a tree, and it looked like that liquid was darker than water. But I was barely able to see it. That's just kind of my interpretation on what I thought I saw, but I definitely heard it hit the ground. And to be honest, I didn't think anything of it because there was no movement after it. Absolutely nothing happened. We just kept walking. And the others noticed it too, but it wasn't something that caused alarm in the group. Like the thing could have just been a squirrel jumping off a tree and my mind made something up. But since we didn't see it clearly, we didn't even bother inspecting it. We just kept going in the direction that we thought we were supposed to. None of us wanted to stop because it didn't feel like we were covering much ground because of the pace that we were forced to go. We also weren't getting very tired because how slow we were going, so even though 2 hours had passed, we were all still pretty energetic and willing to keep moving forward. And over the course of the next hour, I only saw one more thing from my peripheral. It was the same type of liquid spout coming out of a tree. I don't know why it didn't cause alarm, maybe because nothing happened the first time, so why would anything happen the second time? Like, even though I don't know what that is, it hasn't shown me that it's dangerous, so why bother worrying about it? But when another person in your group spots somebody in the distance, and the way that she gasps and utters a name indicates that she can tell who this person is from behind because they're not facing us, it must be a friend of hers and she must be deeply concerned about them. And after Heidi's audible gasp, I look over Bobby's shoulder to see what they're looking at. and I see a man in a blue flannel that's torn to bits, and he has his hands on his knees, completely hunched over. And it seems as if he's heaving and vomiting, and he's only about 50 yards ahead of us. I could tell that everything in Heidi wanted to run up to this man, but she was doing her best to keep her composure and keep our pace. Because if she wasn't going to follow her rules, how can she expect us to? But that didn't stop her from calling out to him as we were on our way up to him. And she was saying things along the lines of, I thought you were dead, you told me you would come back, why didn't you come back? Why aren't you answering me? What's wrong? Are you sick? Corey, are you sick? And it felt like an eternity trying to catch up to this guy, because he wasn't staying still, but he was slowly almost like fumbling forward because he was vomiting and falling over himself, but the slow pace that he was going was as slow as we were going. So if he was moving forward, the distance that we were closing on him wasn't getting smaller. So I watched this guy finally stop, and he just hunches over fully, like if you broke a scarecrow in the middle, his head just hanging by his knees. And Heidi is holding back tears at this point, leisurely walking towards this person, going against every instinct that you would have when you see somebody you care about clearly in pain or distraught. But finally we were able to close the distance on him a little bit because he got up to a tree and leaned his hands onto it, but then he proceeded to start projectile vomiting. He vomited away from us, but we clearly heard it, even though we weren't able to see it. It was very obvious he was hurling. And right when he was finished, he went back into that bent over position, hands on the knees, forehead by the knees. So we eventually catch up to him, and I'm the last one to him because I was behind the other two. Heidi leaned over to try to get a better look at his face and to whisper or speak into his ear because he clearly needed our help. But he wasn't responding to her, and he wasn't even looking towards her. He didn't lift his face to make eye contact. He didn't make any effort to communicate. And I wasn't sure if it was because he had just vomited or he might continue to vomit or if something else was wrong with him. So I slowly circle around to his free side that Heidi wasn't in the way of, and I saw why he wasn't answering her. Initially, I thought he had done the same thing that we had done. I thought he had intentionally covered himself with mud like us, because he had something dark smeared all over him and all over the side of his face. But when I looked at his ear, inside of his ear, it was very clear that he was using something else to cover his scent. But I don't think he was intentionally using it, because this looked like it was coming out of him. There was some type of black liquid oozing out of his ear and dripping down his head. And like I said, he was fully bent over, so I wasn't able to see his face yet. The only thing that I could see is his side profile, and I'm staring at his ear, bubbling, pouring black liquid down the side of his face. It looked like liquid tar, so there was no way he was able to hear Heidi with how thick it was. So I make eye contact with Bobby to make sure that he's seeing what I'm seeing, and he looks very uncomfortable with what he's looking at. I don't know if I mentioned this, but Bobby's an active firefighter. Excuse me if I already did. But it's very common for him to pull up to situations where somebody needs his help. And I've seen on multiple occasions, Bobby switch into firefighter mode and check on somebody and make sure that they're okay. But he wasn't doing this for Corey. He wasn't doing this for the man that was hunched over right in front of us that this girl Heidi was pleading to answer her. Bobby was looking at this man like he was an absolute lost cause, and I was wondering if it was because the entire situation in general, or he had seen something that I hadn't seen yet. It was clear that Corey's head was slightly shifted more in the direction of Heidi and Bobby. I wasn't able to see his face much, and I thought I might be able to get a better look at his face from the other side to see what Bobby's so concerned about, because the ear thing's weird, but Bobby looks like he's looking at something different. And as I'm walking around behind him to the other side, this guy Corey makes a sound so distinct and so unique that I could only describe it as something kind of like a rattlesnake's tail. But he made the sound with his teeth. It was the sound of teeth chattering together so quickly that it sounded like a shake of a rattle. His jaw was like a wind-up toy, and he let off this disturbing, deep rattle every 10 to 15 seconds. And then in between these teeth rattles was this guttural heaving as if he was about to projectile vomit again. So Bobby grabs a hold of Heidi's arm and makes her take a few steps back away from him. And as I turn the corner and I'm able to see Corey's face, I can see that his mouth is wide open, completely agape, and it's pouring and bubbling with that same black tar that was coming out of his ears. His back was all hunched, but his chin was like raised to the sky, and his nostrils were completely flared as if he was trying to sniff the air and pick up a scent. His body language kind of looked like somebody attempting to impersonate a raptor. It almost would have been comical if you weren't able to see his face. His knees were bent, his back was hunched, his nose was to the sky, and his arms were bent like they were like little T-Rex arms. And he had black tar oozing out of his ears and mouth, and his eyes were completely white like he was a blind, senile dog. We all took a couple more steps back because it was very clear that there was something wrong with him. The black liquid that was coming from this guy's mouth was bubbling as if it was boiling inside of him, and it was slowly pouring out of his mouth, down his chin, down the front of his chest, and the ones that were coming from his ears were like pouring down his back when he was turning his head. And I realized in that moment that the smell of this place was coming from him. At least the dirt that we had rubbed on ourselves had the essence of whatever this tar was. Whatever was coming out of this man was the source of the slight stinky smell of the dirt. And we're just staring at him mortified as his teeth chatter and he's trying to catch a scent in the air. He looked like he was in and out of consciousness, or better yet, he looked like he was in and out of whatever raptor position he was in. He would hit these odd raptor-like poses and his teeth would chatter together, but then it was like he would snap out of it for a second and he would fold over with his hands on his knees as if he was trying to catch his breath, and he would stick his fingers in his ears as if he was trying to clear them out, and he would hunch over like that, clearly attempting to let all of the tar pour out of his mouth to catch his breath. And when he was like that, it looked like a man trapped in eternal suffocation. But then something would click and he would pop back up into this animalistic style position, and his teeth would start chattering and he'd be looking around like he had an objective. And at this point, Bobby, Heidi, and I are standing shoulder to shoulder like a couple sardines just staring at this man. We don't know what to do. And finally, Heidi speaks up, and I think she's going to start talking about a game plan to help her friend. But she goes back to being as cold as I've seen her, and she very blankly states that we need to move. And I try to give her some pushback. I tell her, like, I think we should try to help him. Not because I thought we could help him. Like, he did kind of seem like a lost cause, but I didn't want her to feel like we weren't being empathetic. Like, she clearly wanted to help him and was suppressing all of her emotions. I just didn't want her to think that if she was willing to take a risk to help this guy, we wouldn't be willing to help. We would. But I could see in Bobby's eyes that he genuinely did not believe that we could help this man, and I guess Heidi agreed. All she said was, "There's nothing we can do." And she said that sentence with a big exhale, almost as if she was speaking and sighing at the same time. And I only say that because everybody knows when they speak like that, there's nothing we can do. You're pushing some breath out of your mouth. It's the same way you would push air out to like check if your breath smells. And as the last word came out of her mouth, the man standing in front of us snapped his head towards Heidi, and he was back in that same prehistoric posture with his eyes locked onto her, cloudy and blind, his nostrils flared, his back hunched, and his teeth chattering. And he's looking at her like he's a dog that picked up a scent, his head even tilted a little bit to the right like he was curious. There's still black tar oozing from his mouth and ears, and his cloudy white eyes gazing towards us. It was as if he had no idea that somebody was standing next to him until he picked up a scent. Heidi basically slapped herself in the face with both hands covering her mouth because she realized what she just did. It was clear that her friend of hers that was right here was what we were supposed to be worried about here, and it had caught her scent. And for a second there, we thought a fight was about to break out and we were gonna have to restrain this man, or at least fight him off until we could run away. But instead of attacking us, he tilted his nose towards the sky, and the teeth chattering started again. But it was much louder, much more consistent, and much more violent. The rattle of his teeth was much more consistent, much louder, as if he was calling out to something, very similar to like coyotes doing roll call, letting the other coyotes know that they're in the area, like, hey, I'm still here. And whatever Corey was calling to, we were not trying to stick around to meet it. Internally, I didn't know if we were supposed to slowly walk away, like we were doing leading up to this point, or if we were supposed to take off and run. But with Heidi turning around without saying a word and taking off into a sprint, signaled to me that our leisurely stroll was over. We ran for about 50 yards until I finally heard what he was calling to approaching. I want to say it sounded like a stampede approaching, but it was slightly different. You could feel the vibrations of something large headed in our direction, but it didn't sound like hooves hitting the ground. It sounded more like a game show wheel being spun. For a moment, it sounded like it was coming directly towards us, But after a moment, and we were a little bit further away, we could tell that it was going directly towards Corey. No part of me wanted to turn around and see what that thing was, but it seemed as if Bobby and Heidi had other plans, because they slid into what was left of a rotted out fallen tree. They crawled into it, so I did too, because I'm not about to go running off into the forest by myself. If we're getting caught together. And this rotted out tree had a hole in it facing the direction that we came from, so when we crawled into it, we were able to peek out of it and see Corey and see what was approaching. So we're hiding in there, maneuvering our heads to get the right angle, because when you got the right angle, you're able to see Corey standing there in his odd posture, awaiting for his friend to arrive. And right as we got in there, instinctually, we all did the same thing. We started scraping on the soft parts of the interior of this rotten tree and started rubbing it on our armpits, anywhere we sweat, just tried to cover our scent, because this was the first time that we ran. It was clear that Heidi was correct, and whatever was out here, these things that were out here, were able to pick up on the smallest particle of a scent. So it was clear that we needed to double down on covering up. We had to get as stinky as possible. So we're locked on Corey, and we see movement coming from the trees off to the right of where we were just standing a couple moments ago. And I don't know what that thing was. I don't know what I was expecting to see, but nothing could have prepared me for what came out into that clearing. I wasn't able to see the minute details of this thing, but I could explain to you what it was shaped like and how it moved. First off, it moved so fast that I'm pretty sure it circled Corey 3 times before I could even blink. It was like it was violently and aggressively searching the immediate area to find what Corey was calling to it for. And this thing moved so closely to the ground, it made no sense how it could be so fast. It moved kind of like a snake, but it had tons of short limbs, kind of like one of those thick, dark centipedes. But it wasn't an insect. It didn't look like an insect. If I were to categorize it, I would say probably a mammal covered in that black tar that was oozing out of Corey's mouth. But its movements were that of a hyper-violent insect, moving at a speed that would only make sense for something incredibly small. And we're horrified watching this thing scramble around the area where we were just standing. It was clearly trying to pick up a scent on us, and I know we were all internally praying that we didn't drop something or breathe out of our mouths too heavily or drop a skin particle and that's all it took and it would know exactly where we were. It was zooming around in different areas trying to get even a glimpse of our scent, and its face was pressed directly into the dirt like it was trying to absorb a particle of a scent until it stopped, but its head stopped first. Eventually the rest of its body caught up to it and it all stopped, and it had coiled around itself right exactly where we were standing, with its face pressed against the dirt, taking deep inhales as if it found us. I don't know if it was scarier watching it move, or watching it stay still, or watching its head jerk up in our direction. And it's as if it knew exactly where we were and began to stand up on its hind legs that we didn't know it had. And it's not like it just stood up. It was as if it started from the back of its very long body, and vertebrae by vertebrae stood up until it was about 20 feet tall, with its head pointing down in our direction, a straight line with a tilted, curved, hooked head looking right at us. All we could do is start scraping more of the rotten wood, rubbing it all over us, then filling our hands with it, picking our shirts up over our mouths, and then covering our mouth with that wet dirt, using it like a makeshift mask. So each breath had to go through a rotten filter. It took only a couple moments, being 20-25 feet tall, before it ripped itself back down into a prone position, a foot off the floor, in a ready attack position, and took off towards us at a horrible, unnatural speed. There was nothing that we could do but brace for impact and hope that whatever was about to happen was painless for the most part. It was coming towards us so fast that there was no point in drawing our weapon. There was no way we would be able to get a clean shot off. We were basically just deer in headlights. We had to wait. And there's no way we were going to be able to fight this thing off. Didn't look like it had a weak point. It was massive, it was fast, it was clearly violent. All we could do is keep our hands pressed to our face and hope that it didn't smell us. So that's exactly what we did. But we only had to wait for about 3 seconds because this thing was so fast. Because by the time 6 seconds passed, it was well beyond where we were hiding, and it didn't sound like it was slowing down anytime soon. It didn't know where we went. It had no idea where we were hiding. It only knew what direction we went, but it had already overran us. The rotten log that we were hiding in clearly covered up our scent. But now the only question was, do we try to run now that we know that there's a hypersonic mammal insect hunting us? Or do we continue to walk slowly and follow the original plan? We waited until the sound of that creature was so far in the distance before we started speaking to each other. We wanted to make sure we weren't in that thing's smell range, and we wanted to have a little bit of a discussion before we crawled out of that rotten log, because we felt like it would be a better idea to make a game plan while we still had cover, so we didn't have to risk speaking and opening our mouths as we continued the hike. And the game plan was simple. We were going to continue to hike slow because we didn't know if this thing could also feel vibrations, so we knew we didn't want to pick up the pace. Our best bet was continue walking slowly and quietly and reapplying dirt as often as possible. We didn't have a run-in with this thing for the first 2 hours we were out there, so clearly what we were doing was working. We had no intention of ending up like Corey, so we all nodded in agreement and crawled out of the tree, and we started walking at a snail's pace in the same direction that we were headed before. We were all scared before we saw that thing, but once we saw how it could move, there was a different tension in the air. And when we started walking again, none of us wanted to risk speaking, so it was dead quiet. The only thing that changed was the fact that we were reapplying dirt maybe twice, 3 times as often. And every few minutes we would hear that odd, stampede-like rumbling in the distance, and it reminded us that that thing hadn't forgotten about us. It was still searching. It might have lost our scent, but it hadn't quit, and it was scavenging this forest tirelessly. And every time it got close, all of us would squat down, reach, and try to grab the grimiest bit of dirt that we could find and rub it all over ourselves. In any other situation, this would be humiliating and unbearable. But when that sound would start approaching again, it was the only thing that was comforting. The worse that dirt smelt, the safer you felt. This went on for 30, maybe 45 minutes until we saw a small clearing in the distance. It was only a couple 100 feet ahead of us, and I could feel the excitement coming off of the other two. But I wasn't excited yet. Like, yeah, I could see the clearing, but we were walking in a single file line, so I wasn't able to see what they were seeing. But when we finally got up to this clearing, and I was able to see what they were seeing because I was able to stand side by side with them, I immediately got a wave of relief that was followed by a wave of confusion. I was looking at another one of the gaps, just one of these naked, obscure cluster of branches with a weird gap in the middle. But it was another picture-perfect thing that stood out, and it looked completely identical to the one that we saw at the village that we came through before. And part of me thought that this might be the exact same one, and we just walked in a big circle, and we were standing exactly where we came from. That gave me a wave of anxiety that was quickly enhanced once I saw what was standing next to the gap. There was a small sign and a small table that was similar to one that you would see standing next to a reclining chair. And the sign that was next to this like little coffee table thing was like one of those signs that you see in the lobby of just about every restaurant that just says like, please wait to be seated. And I tried to remember back to when we initially came through the gap before our hike started, if that table and that sign were there. But I was positive that there definitely wasn't one. And that gave me a little bit of relief, but not a lot. So I scanned the area to see if it resembled where we came in through, but it didn't at all. It was definitely a different terrain. We were definitely in a different place, so it was definitely a different gap. But there was something very off about seeing a table and a sign next to it. And it was placed there as if we were supposed to read it before using the gap. And I felt frozen in that situation. But Heidi didn't. Heidi immediately stepped into action and started approaching the table. She clearly wanted to get up to it and read it, so Bobby and I look at each other and we're like, all right, let's follow her lead. We want to see what it says, so we march up to it behind her. And I don't know what I was expecting to read in that situation based on everything else that we had experienced that day, but somehow it still surprised me because it seemed to be some type of challenge or like some type of game. And that made just about everything more confusing, and if I'm being honest with you, in that moment, it made me trust Heidi less. Because this game or challenge, whatever this thing is, must have been left here by someone, and we don't know this girl. And she's acting like this is normal. Nothing up to this point has been normal, but this is very obscure, and she's approaching it as if this is just every day. And the way she calmly read the sign and was like, yep, we're gonna start the game, as if she was used to this kind of thing, was very suspicious to me. Like, why wasn't your first question, who left this here? And clearly Bobby had the same thought that I did, because he put both of his hands up to get both of our attention. Like, yo, stop for a second. There's questions that need to be answered. One being, who left this sign here? And at the same time he's posing this question to the group, he reaches over to the table and picks up a cup that was sitting on this table. And Heidi rolled her eyes at his question and at his suspicion, and she shot her gaze over to me to see if I was going to go along with her or go along with him. But I was in Bobby's boat completely. What is going on here? And she starts urging us to go along with it and help her fulfill this task, no questions asked. But this task required the cup that Bobby was holding. But Bobby's standing there firm, like, yo, you are not getting this back until you give us some form of explanation, because you know something about this. And she very frustratedly said, this place just does things like this sometimes. It'll throw random games at us. And if we ignore the games, something bad usually happens. And if we fulfill them, we usually get rewarded. But I know for sure that we need to fulfill this task to open that gap. But she didn't answer the question, so we cut her off and we're like, who is leaving the games here? But before I could even get that question out, she claps back very upset, which seemed to be genuine frustration with her situation. She said, we have no idea. We don't even know who made this place. We don't know who leaves us games. We don't know who trapped us here. All I know is that we need to fulfill this task before that thing finds us. She was convincing enough to gain a little bit of trust back for me. It seemed very genuine. But what did she mean she didn't know who trapped us here? She clearly knew the people that put us through this first gap. She clearly had relationships with them. And she wasn't in handcuffs when we first saw her. She was voluntarily sitting with these people. So she wasn't trapped by any means, but she was right about one thing. We sure as hell needed to get out of here before that thing found us. And if it meant fulfilling a silly task or playing a stupid game, we were going to do that. And once we knew that we were safe, we could get all of the answers that we were looking for. So I read this sign again, and it was as weird as the first time that I read it. The sign said, ink in the cup, ink in the jar, when it's full, safety is not far. So I look back at the cup that's in Bobby's hands that he's spinning around and inspecting very deeply, like as if he's trying to study every detail. And then I look back to the table that he picked the cup off of, and there's a fairly large mason jar on it. It wasn't exactly a mason jar, it was more kind of like this jug thing, but I guess it looked like a mason jar, but it just had more detail on it and had like glass engravings of a line and designs, but the line indicated probably how high we needed to fill it for us to win the game. The game seemed pretty straightforward. We use the cup to fill the jar, and then once the jar is full, the gap will open for us. And it only took a second for the light bulb to go off in my head, so I announced to the group, yo, we need to find Corey. And I see a spark of realization in Bobby's eyes as if he just came to the same conclusion that I did. But I didn't see that same spark in Heidi's eyes. Not that she didn't realize what I was saying, but it was more like she had come to a different conclusion that I had. What I realized was that the bubbling tar that I saw pouring out of Corey's ears and mouth was the ink that this sign was referring to. It was the only substance here that resembled ink, and it was pitch black like squid's ink. So some of the details about this place and what we learned from Heidi were coming together for me. Corey was the squid. He couldn't hear us or see us, but he was able to smell us. But it was true that we had to hide our scent. And maybe the thing that Corey called to, the big fast one, maybe that was the squid. And that thing did that to Corey, making Corey a mini squid. Either way, it was coming together a bit. But I didn't think there was any good reason that we would need to gather the ink from the large, fast, scary squid. The ink that was pouring out of Corey's ears and mouth seemed to be the exact same thing that the large one was covered in. So why don't we collect it from the blind deaf guy who walks really slow, instead of the homicidal massive mammal insect? Corey didn't seem to be moving much at all. He'd stumble, he'd lean over, he'd hit some poses, but we could probably just walk back in the same direction that we came and find him. But Heidi seemed to have other plans because she had already taken her drawstring backpack off of her back and opened it. And she let the group know that we weren't going anywhere and we were going to make Corey come to us. She made a good point. She didn't want to risk splitting up, and she also didn't want to risk not being able to find the gap again. She also made another really good point. The large mason jar type thing was much bigger than the cup, and it was going to take probably 10 cupfuls to fill it. So we wouldn't want to find Corey 20 minutes away, fill up one cup of ink, have to walk walk all the way back to the gap, then go have to find Corey again. We were much better off risking trying to get Corey to come to us, and if the big squid comes, it's worth the risk, because we could just do the same thing that we did last time. If we cover ourselves well, we're far enough away, the thing will just shoot off in a random direction and go on a hunting spree again. And Corey would stay in the same place where we just were, and we would be able to harvest his ink and fill this mason jar easy peasy. And at this point, Heidi already had her hand in her backpack, but before she pulled anything out, she said this to the group: "I don't care if you guys find this disgusting. I knew that there was a possibility that I was going to be out here today. So I came out here prepared, and I figured that there might come a time where I need a decoy scent. And this is the best thing that I could come up with the resources that I had." And this girl pulls out an old jar, and the old jar was filled with a dark yellow liquid. I knew what it was immediately, and I understood exactly why she made that disclaimer before pulling it out. In any other circumstance, it probably would have been very weird and very gross that she was carrying around a jar of her own piss, but in this case, I was very happy she had it. And Bobby clearly felt the same way. He was like very resourceful, and we both gave her an approving nod, because the first thing that came to my head was like, maybe I'll go run over to the other side of the clearing, take a piss on a tree, and run back. But this was way better. We could just plant it over there. I already knew what the plan was going to be, but I let her explain it to us, and she basically said, "We're gonna go place this on the other side of the clearing, and we're going to put the cup that Bobby has right next to it, and then we're going to throw rocks from where we are until we break that jar, and hopefully after it breaks, the big one comes first, has a frenzy, and takes off into the woods, and then Corey emerges from the woods 20 minutes later, leisurely, and gives us exactly what we need. And best case scenario, he hunches over that cup and fills it to the brim. But either way, if he gets close, we could handle it, we could harvest him, and we can get out of here." Listen, it wasn't the best plan in history. I'm not going to pretend it was, but it was our plan. It was the best plan that we had. So we went along with it, and we walked over and we placed the cup and the jar at the edge of the clearing in the direction where we knew Corey probably still was. And we got about 30 feet away from it, gathered a bunch of rocks, and we started launching them. It took us about 10 minutes because obviously we're missing quite a few throws, but eventually Bobby nicked the side of it and the whole jar broke, and right then it exposed the scent to the woods. Part of me expected to hear that stampeding sound from the large squid the second that it broke, but that's not what happened here. What happened was that I had a realization that we hadn't been looking behind us while we were walking very often, because if we had been looking behind us, we probably would have noticed that borderline every tree in this forest had the trunk hollowed out, and there was a little crevice at the base of every trunk where if somebody crouched down and backed up into it, they could hide in the shadows at the base of just about every tree. And when that jar cracked, I saw 2 white dots light up in just about every dark crevice of almost every tree in this forest, looking directly at us. The forest looked like a group of people holding up lighters at a concert, but I knew exactly what those 2 white dots were, because I couldn't stop looking at Corey's cloudy white eyes. I don't know if the other 2 realized the moment that I did, but they sure as hell realized when these things started pouring out of the forest into the clearing. And these things came out sprinting and savagely piling themselves on top of this broken jar and puddle of piss as if they were trying to doggy pile on top of it. They weren't necessarily attacking it. It was more like they were in a frenzy. And along with the frenzy came an exile of their ink. It was just pouring out of them. And then it hit me and I realized what that first thing was. The first thing that I saw from my peripheral vision when we got into this forest. Before we even found Corey, the light spout of liquid, I realized what it was. It was one of these things shooting ink from its mouth like a spout, because the ones that weren't in the doggy pile frenzy on top of the broken piss jar were spouting ink onto the pile. And eventually the doggy pile frenzy started to disperse because they realized that there was nothing attached to the scent. But it almost seemed like they were actively trying to cover up the scent with their ink. They were taking turns spouting into the general area, creating a large puddle of this black ink. And eventually they completely covered the broken jar, and they also completely covered the cup that we were supposed to be using to collect it. And at this point, the whole clearing was filled with these wandering squids, and they're just walking around, waddling, chattering their teeth with their nose in the air. They looked way less human than Corey did. Whatever that big squid did to them, this was clearly like the final state of that. Whatever had happened to Corey must have happened very recently, because these things were barely human, but they moved like Corey was kind of impersonating. They were contorted creatures with exposed teeth, covered almost head to toe in their ink. It looked like they not only had ink pouring out of their ears and their mouth, but it looked like it was almost coming out of their pores as well, making them almost completely black. They had similar body language to Corey when they weren't in a frenzy. It was almost as if they were at rest or in some type of hibernation state. They were just mindlessly walking around. And every once in a while, they would just spout some ink out of their mouth and then shoot their nose to the sky, flaring it, trying to catch a scent. And we waited for about 5 nerve-wracking minutes before we made the decision to take a chance and weave our way through this maze of waddling squids. And the goal was to attempt to find the cup and try to gather the ink. We weren't able to speak with each other in that moment, so we relied on hand gestures and eye movement. But the plan was pretty simple, like it wasn't hard to get the idea across. But the issue was that we didn't know if this puddle of black ink that they left for us very conveniently, we didn't know if it was gonna sink into the ground. So we didn't know how much time we had to gather it. Like the earth might absorb it, and we didn't want to risk losing it, because even though there was a horde of them ready for harvest, they actually seemed to do us a favor, because they were trying to cover the scent of the piss jar, and they just left all of this ink on the floor. Like they did us a massive solid. So we start weaving our way through, attempting to not bump into any of them. We all had our shirts covering our mouths, and we were all breathing through our noses, trying to make sure that they didn't pick up our scent. And as we got up to the puddle of ink, I realized that there was a lot more of it than I was expecting. And it was a lot thicker than ink. It was a lot closer to a tar than an ink. So it kind of stuck together more, almost like molten lava. It didn't spread out into a massive area. It was a couple inches thick. But because of that, we had no choice but to get on our hands and knees and crawl through this puddle of ink tar. And we had to feel around on the ground for the cup, because we didn't know if it got moved around. We couldn't tell where it was. We also had to be sure to not be so reckless and wipe our hand over a part of the broken jar and risk getting cut, because who knows what this black liquid actually is. Just getting it on our skin felt like a major risk, and the last thing that we wanted to do was get it into an open wound. So we were slowly and quietly and gently searching for this lost cup, and we're getting covered head to toe with this black tar because it was all so slippery. Even on all fours, it was hard to stay upright. All of us slipped once or twice and got our chest in it, or the side of our face, our entire arm, our whole leg, our whole side. We were covered in this stuff, and most of our body was covered in this ink by the time Bobby found the cup. And then he held the cup up to get our attention, waved it a little bit, and once we saw that he had it, we made our way to the edge of the large puddle and filled it for the first time. We took precaution though. We didn't want to just run over there, because we knew we were going to have to fill it multiple times. And again, we had to rely on making a game plan with our eyes and our hand gestures. And the plan was to let Bobby fill it up, and he just go alone and weave through the squid the first time. And our job was to sit and wait at the edge of the puddle, because you have to remember, these things were wandering around everywhere. But they weren't wandering around inside of the large puddle that they left. It was slippery. So if we stayed in it, there was a much less risk of them bumping into one of us. And if all 3 of us had to weave through every time, we would raise our chances of them picking up our scent. Bobby seemed up to the task, so we let him do it. And he was doing phenomenal. He was tiptoeing his way through this squid horde, filling it up a little bit each time. Everything in me wanted to get out of this puddle, because again, we didn't know what this liquid was, but it's not like there was anything around to wipe it off. So even if I got out of the puddle, I wasn't going to be able to get it off of me. So my risk manager calculator in my brain just told me to stay in it. So that's what I did. And finally, after about 10 rounds of Bobby going back and forth, he signaled to us that this one was probably going to be the last one. So Heidi and I stood up, and we were attempting to not slip because it was very difficult, but we managed to get out of it, and we followed him through the horde. All 3 of us tiptoeing as quiet as possible, and we very quickly realized that it was a fantastic idea to only have one person do it, because all 3 of us moving through this horde clearly changed the tone. They seemed to be whipping their heads around a little bit more actively and sniffing the air. They knew something was up. It was as if they got a faint scent of us, but they couldn't be sure. More and more of them started sniffing the air, and the chatters of their teeth started to bind together, and all of them doing it at the same time collectively made this low rumble. We all knew that they were onto us, so it was impossible for us to keep our cool because we knew how close we were. Bobby already had 10 repetitions going back and forth, so he beat us back to the jar by about 30 feet. But Heidi and I were stuck dead center of this horde in the middle of this clearing when all of them collectively were like, "Something's up," and called out to the big one. They all rattled their teeth in the exact same way that Corey did when he called to it. But with this many of them doing it all at the same time, I felt it in my skull. It felt like the whole forest was vibrating, and fear filled my entire being. Heidi and I both stopped walking for a moment, waiting for them to stop. And I'm looking up towards the gap as Bobby's finishing the mason jar. He's pouring the last couple drips in. It definitely hit that line. And I noticed this slight sheen appear in the middle of this gap. It wasn't glowing or anything, but something slightly changed. I knew something else was there, so it was clear we accomplished this task. We won the game. At least I was pretty sure, because part of me thought my eyes might be vibrating and shaking and making this look different than it actually is. I couldn't tell if the rattling of the squid's teeth was messing with my vision. I was planning on moving when they finally stopped because there was something about the vibration that kind of messed up my equilibrium. But I heard something on top of their rattling vibration, and it was the stampede of the big one closing in on us fast. All of the little squids went silent when the stampede started, and I realized that the source of that sound, the stampede, was coming from beyond the other side of the gap. So where we were headed, it was headed directly back towards us. So we had to beat it to the gap by running towards it. And the first thing that I think is this thing is gonna pop out and destroy it. He's gonna knock into the mason jar filled with ink, and we're gonna have no way out. And we're gonna be trapped here. If there's no game to win, the gap's not gonna open. So at this point, it did not matter that we were surrounded by these little squids. We had to get through the gap before that big one got here and ruined everything. So I had no choice but to yell, "Run," and it set off a frenzy because they smelt me immediately. So we take off running, slipping almost every step because our shoes are covered in this slippery ink, and we're doing our best weaving through this horde of frenzied squid with the other one, the big one, barreling towards us in the other direction. So Bobby gets to the gap, Heidi gets to the gap, they're gone, but I still have about 5-10 steps until I'm to the gap. And I could see the big squid barreling towards me only about 20 yards away on the other side. And it's ready to tear me to pieces and turn me into one of its minions. I know for sure it smells me and it is not going to hesitate. So I dive forward, taking a leap of faith. This thing has already closed the distance and it's leaping towards me. I close my eyes and I brace for impact, not sure if this thing is going to get to me before I could get through it. And I hit the ground and I immediately feel this horrible burning sensation all over my body. And I open my eyes expecting to see this massive creature wrapped around me with hundreds if not thousands of poisonous spikes causing this pain that I'm feeling. But I'm in a bright open field with only Heidi and Bobby rolling around in agony next to me. And my entire body feels like it's on fire. The pain was so sudden and so excruciating. It almost felt like getting tased. I felt like I didn't have any control over my bodily function. My body was stiff, my fingers were throwing up gang signs, and my toes were curling, and I couldn't get my jaw to unclench, and I felt my back start spasming. Both of my calves started to cramp, my quads felt like they were becoming knots, and the other two were clearly going through the exact same thing that I was. And I'm waiting for this pain to stop, absolutely paralyzed, but it wouldn't. And I tried to move my hands and my feet, and I was able to slightly. So I roll over to my other side, trying to get a gauge of our surroundings. I just want to see if we're actually safe, and when I'm able to roll over, I see a pond that looks like an absolute oasis. And I knew at this point that the ink was causing this pain, because when I looked down at my arms, the places that had more ink were burning worse. So I knew that I needed to wash this off as soon as possible. So I scratch and claw and squirm my way to this pond, and I just pull myself into it face first. I couldn't care less what was in this pond. I couldn't care if there was a great white shark waiting for me. There could have been a crocodile, a kraken. I still would have rolled my body body into that water with how much pain I was in. I couldn't get myself to speak because of the pain, so I didn't know if Heidi and Bobby were following me. But the relief that I felt from being in that water was pure bliss. It didn't just feel like water, it felt like an instant painkiller. It was as if this pond was made to relieve the pain of that squid ink. It felt like absolute ecstasy rubbing the squid ink and the mud off of me. And very quickly I realized that Bobby was also following my lead because he splashed into the pond next to me, and he let out this loud sigh of relief as he started cleaning himself. And me and him were so dirty with ink and mud, we turned this crystal clear water into that cloud of black goop. Well, at least immediately around us looked like there was an oil spill, and we looked like a couple ducks getting cleaned in a Dawn commercial. So I cup a little bit of water to bring it up to my face, and after I'm done scrubbing my face, I dunk my head underwater and I pop my head back out, let the water fall off my face so I can open my eyes, and I look to see if Heidi has made her way to the water. And in that moment I felt so bad because I was so consumed with relieving my own pain that I didn't realize that whatever was happening was clearly affecting her worse. She was on her stomach, shaking in agony with her hand reached out towards us. Her head was swinging side to side and her mouth was wide open as if she was trying to scream something at us. But all the pain that she was going through was holding her voice in. I basically slapped Bobby in the chest to get his attention, and we both bear crawl out of the pond. We get to Heidi as quickly as we possibly could, and when I grabbed her shirt in an attempt to drag her towards the pond, my hands immediately started to burn again. I wasn't expecting that pain to come back so quickly because it had taken so long to set in the first time. So when I grabbed her shirt, I immediately started pulling backwards with my legs, but I had to let go once my hands started burning, so I fell onto my butt. And when I stood up to try to make another attempt at dragging her to try to push through the pain because I wasn't expecting it the first time, she managed to get a couple words out, and in a very raspy tone, completely laced with pain, she managed to say, "No water, you can't go in the water." It was a little bit late for that. Obviously we were just in there scrubbing ourselves clean, but nothing bad happened to us while we were in there. It was great. It completely relieved our pain, but she seemed absolutely dead set on not getting in that water. We asked her what she wanted us to do, but she was still having a hard time speaking. But she managed to roll to her back, take her backpack off, and open her drawstring backpack. And she pulled out this like small little hand towel and started wiping herself with it while it was dry. And then she proceeded to use the grass around us to clean the towel, but it's not like she was actually cleaning it. After she wiped herself like 4 times, this looked like a towel at an auto shop covered in oil. Part of me wanted to drag her into the water against her will so she could see how relieving it was, but she clearly didn't want that, and to be honest, it was very hard watching her sit through this pain. I couldn't imagine having to dry wash myself after that experience. I knew exactly the type of pain she was going through, and to rub it with a dry towel seemed like torture. We sat around her kind of awkwardly, just attempting to give her moral support as she cleaned herself. It didn't give her the full relief that the water gave us, but it was definitely helping her recover. Eventually the pain was bearable enough for her to start speaking. Even though she was cleaner, there was still some residual ink left on her skin burning her, but she managed to get these words out. Dr. Doyle told me that no matter how much pain you're in, no matter how much it burns, don't go into the water in gap 2. And I didn't want to be rude in that situation because I was feeling for her. I could tell that she was still in pain, but I felt like it was about time she gave us a little bit more information on this infamous Dr. Doyle. She made it clear that she didn't know much about this place, but this was the second time she referred to Dr. Doyle. And since his first piece of advice was pretty good about us covering our scent, I felt like it was pretty important for her to start sharing with us the rest of the advice that he had given her. So I tried to demand those answers as gently as possible. So I simply said, "It doesn't seem like anything's going on where we are right now. I think we have some time to rest, and I think it's in everybody's best interest if you tell us all the tips that Dr. Doyle gave to you." And I'm sure Bobby's as curious as I am to know who Dr. Doyle is and how he knows these tips. I could tell that Heidi didn't want to do a long-winded answer in that moment. I could tell that she just wanted to breathe through the pain that she was experiencing. But I could tell in her face that this was the first time that she felt like she genuinely needed help. So she took a deep breath and she told us this. "Dr. Doyle was the man that you saw at the podium. He was also the man that you were fighting with. But he's not a bad man. He prepared me for this. I wasn't upset with him. He was only doing what he had to do, and he's been out here and he's studied this place. And if he told me not to go into the water, I'm not going into the water. Bobby answered her, trying to get more information from her. He excitedly said, "You're telling me Dr. Doyle made it through this and he's made it back?" I didn't feel like that was the most pressing question in that moment, but I was curious. I was more curious about what's so wrong with the water, but Heidi answered Bobby's question because she couldn't read my mind. She said, "He barely made it through, but yes, he did, so I plan on doing everything that he told me to do." He doesn't know every secret of this place. He's pretty confused too, and he doesn't know exactly how he made it back. He was out here alone, and he said that he felt very lucky that he made it all the way through. But he was right about the squid. He was right about gap 1, so I can only assume he's right about gap 2, and he's right about the water. That threw another question in my head, and I wanted to blurt it out before Bobby asked his next question. Is there anything else that he told you that you think that he's right about that we should know beforehand? Because if we knew to not go in the water an hour ago, I would have listened. And I could see a little bit of guilt on Heidi's face because she knew that I was right. She realized that her frustration with us tagging along, and probably her situation in general, led her to withhold information from us. And that information could have stopped us from doing something that she perceived as stupid. Because the first piece of advice that she gave us was so straightforward and so correct about covering our scent. And not going in the water sounds pretty straightforward. And if you got the first one correct, we would probably assume the second one was correct as well. So Bobby and I probably just royally screwed up because she didn't want to tell us tip number 2. So she proceeded to tell us the rest of the tips that she knew about getting through this. It wasn't much, but something's better than nothing. So she looks around and I could tell she's trying to gather all of them, and she says, "Don't go in the water, rest before the river, nothing's coming for you." And also guys, by the way, there's one more gap after this one. And the only tip that he gave me for the last gap was, "They're not your friends." And he also said that he went through home. I don't know what he meant when he said that, but apparently he went through home. And he told me that that would make sense if I got to the end. So we're like, okay, based on his tips, we knew that this is where we are going to rest and recover before we move forward. And when I looked towards the direction where we were most likely headed, I could see a river in the distance. And only about 50 yards beyond that river was the next clear gap that we had to go through. Like, it was literally right there. We did not have to search for it. And we were no longer in a very dense forest. Now we were in a large open clearing. But it seemed as if we were caged in this clearing by very steep rock walls, and you could slightly see the rock walls through the trees that line the walls. The place almost felt like an arena. You know what it actually felt like? It felt like when you're golfing on a par 6 golf course with the really long holes, like 300-400 yards to get to the hole, and then one of the holes is like a par 3, and you could see the flag from the spot that you tee off. It's like, this feels weird. We've been journeying to each hole 5-6 shots, but now we could just see it. We could pull out the 7-iron and it takes 1 shot to get on the green. The gap that we were in currently was significantly smaller than the last one, and the task was extremely straightforward. It was very simple. It was clear that we had to cross that river and walk through the next gap. There was no sign or game. The challenge seemed to be this river. So the only things that seemed to be in this makeshift arena was the pond that we washed off in, us, this river, and the next gap. Heidi was clearly done talking and she was still in pain, so she curled up into a ball in an attempt to get some rest before this next challenge. I was planning on doing the same thing, but I couldn't help but to start pacing. And the pacing led me back to the edge of the pond that Bobby and I had washed ourselves in. And what I saw in the water made me call over to Bobby immediately. And he rushed over to see what I was referring to, and I just point at the water and I go, "Bro, have you ever seen anything like that?" He shook his head with a very simple no. Then we both proceeded to watch the ink that we had washed off our bodies into this pond pull together into 2 very clear clumps of coagulating tar. And these coagulating clumps of tar seemed to be interacting with each other just below the surface of the water. They weren't moving much, but it was clear that they were mirroring each other slightly. And we stood at the edge of this pond watching these seemingly conscious bodies of black liquid until they shot off into the distance of the pond like they were dolphins fleeing. And like I said, the pond wasn't that small. It wasn't massive. We could run around to the other side to see if they went over there, but if they went into the middle of the pond, we would have to go into the water to see what they were doing. We had no idea what the ink had turned into. It left the residual mud behind. It was clear that only the ink had pulled together, and we were not going back into that water to find out. And we figured that the pond and the river weren't connected, so if we don't go back into this water, we wouldn't have to deal with it. We weren't extremely confident in that conclusion, illusion, but it's what we had to tell ourselves so we could fall asleep for a little bit. And this might seem absolutely ridiculous, but I had one of the best night's sleeps I've ever had in the middle of that clearing on that soft grass. And like I said before, the water that we washed ourselves in, that pond, felt like pure ecstasy. My body felt like I took an Epsom salt bath with a CBD bath bomb in it, then rubbed Tiger Balm all over myself. My skin felt like it was humming with relaxation and comfort. And during my night's sleep, I felt comforted. I almost felt like a little spoon being cuddled from the back. And to be honest, I woke up absolutely refreshed. I wasn't particularly happy about the situation I was in, but I felt good and I felt rested. And I could say the same thing for Bobby, but I definitely could not say the same thing for Heidi. Heidi looked like she had been in and out of sleep the entire night, and her skin clearly started breaking out in rashes and she couldn't stop scratching herself. She was in horrible pain and discomfort, and it felt so unfair that my body felt so good. I felt so ready to move on to the next task, but this girl had suffered all night. And honestly, I even started doubting the tips that Dr. Doyle gave her, because I couldn't imagine how washing off in that miracle water could be a disadvantage. So Bobby and I both get up and we start walking around the area just to make sure that there's nothing in the area threatening. And for some reason, when I finally stood up completely, when I got all the way to my feet and looked around and gazed at the horizon around us, I got this horrible wave of anxiety. I don't even know if I should call it anxiety. If anything, it felt more like a claustrophobic panic. Like, I knew that we were stuck here before. I knew that we weren't in a good situation. But for some reason, standing up in this place and looking around felt like the entire world was closing in on me. So much so that I actually started ducking and covering my eyes so the sun would stop glaring into them so heavily. It felt unnaturally bright, and when I put my right hand up to give myself some shade to keep the sun out of my eyes, it didn't work. There was something about this place that was overly illuminated. It wasn't particularly hot there, but the way the sun was shining felt like Phoenix in the summer. And I felt Bobby lean into me as if he was also feeling these waves of vertigo and panic. And we both basically fell back into Heidi, who was doing her best to hold us up. And it took us a few minutes of good deep breathing and leaning on one another to calm down. I hadn't felt that way since I had taken a Bang Energy pre-workout on an empty stomach, and it caused severe heart palpitations and rolling panic attacks. But just as I started to gather myself, Bobby looked up into the sky and started freaking out, and he started pointing up towards the sun, and he's saying, "Why are there two? Why are there two?" So I look up and I do my best to use my hands to block out the main source of light, because I'm trying to see what he's referring to past the glare of the sun. Part of me thought there was going to be some type of creature flying around above us or swooping down to attack us, but what I saw was far worse. I was looking up at two suns, and let me make this extremely clear. You have woken up every day of your life to one sun. When you look up into the sky during the day, you see our friend, the sun. When you look up into the starry night, you see our friend, the moon. But I'm looking up into the sky and I see two suns, and there's one on each half of the sky, and they're both shining as bright as one another. That's what was causing this intense illumination of the area, and that's why everything felt a little bit off. Like, usually you could turn your back to the sun and get a little bit of shade on your face and eyes, and usually when you're looking at somebody and they are turning their head, they're giving you a different angle of their face, you could see shadows on their face depending on what angle the sun is shining. You don't realize how used to shadows you are until you're somewhere that's so illuminated, like you're at a photo shoot surrounded by soft lights. It doesn't feel like real life. It feels like a fever dream. And we all instinctively take a couple steps back away from each other, looking up towards the two suns. And then we look back at one another, and I swear, from my point of view, it looked like we were in a cinematic movie. It was too perfect. It looked like we were on set of something. But the weirdest part was the fact that we had two shadows, because there was two suns in the sky. And you never realize how weird that looks, because you're so used to the sun being on one side of the sky, and it usually casts a shadow in one direction. But when you see two, it's overwhelmingly disorienting, especially because if there's two suns in the sky, there probably shouldn't be a shadow on either side. Yet there's two next to us because of the angle in which each one is shining. And it's like one of those things that once you see it, you can't unsee it. And on top of the fact that we had two shadows, Heidi didn't even have one. The ink residue that was still on her skin and her face and all of her clothes, it looked almost as if it was absorbing all of the light that was coming to her, and she looked gray and void of life. And I'm looking at Bobby and he looks illuminated and rejuvenated and full of color, while Heidi's looking like somebody's draining the joy of life out of her, and she's a black and white character in a color film. It was like she was Spider-Man Noir from the Into the Spider-Verse films. And that's when I really started doubting Dr. Doyle's advice, because even though the illumination was freaky and unsettling, the worst part about it was that it highlighted just how bad of shape Heidi was in. And I was starting to get a little bit concerned that she might start turning into what Corey turned into. That's how gray her skin was looking. And yes, you can attribute that to a bad night's sleep and the rashes and the pain, but you can't pretend like not washing off that ink didn't have major repercussions. And I could tell that Bobby was thinking the same thing, because he was genuinely concerned about her. And she could see it in our faces the way that she was looking. So she immediately started defending herself. She's like, guys, I know I look bad, but we need to focus on getting through the next gap. If it starts to get worse, I will be honest with you guys. I know what you're thinking. And I had my concerns too, but I promise you, I don't feel as bad as I look. And if you hear my teeth start chattering, I will not be mad at you if you leave me behind. But for right now, I promise I'm okay. This was very reassuring to us because she was very self-aware. She acknowledged our concerns and she agreed that we should probably be concerned. But for the time being, she still felt like a trustworthy, capable part of the team. So we're all standing there with nothing left to do but attempt the next task. So we turn towards the river in the gap and we start walking towards it. And every step that we got closer felt like an inch closer to my impending doom. The river was much wider than I thought it was, and the water was much rougher than I realized. It was very clear that this was a deep, raging river. And if you weren't a strong swimmer, it was very clear that this thing would swallow you whole. So when we get to the edge of the river, I look to both ends to see where it leads. And both ends of this river ran directly into the rock walls that were to my right and left. It looked like if you let this river take you, you would end up into some underground cave river. I highly doubted that it would take you to safety, so that was not an option. It looked like it would just plummet you into darkness, and you would just bash your skull and limbs off of rocks until you finally drown. And then I thought, this must be the water that Dr. Doyle was referring to when he said don't go in it, because this thing was flowing like a class 5 rapid. And this thing was way too wide for us to leap across, and it would be a risk to try to swim it. We would have to build some type of bridge to get across it. So I'm thinking we're about to start gathering branches to throw something together in an attempt, like some raft or some bridge. But then Bobby gets the group's attention and he's pointing at something off to the left. And Heidi and I both look over and we see one of those carnival ladders. You know, one of those rigged ladders that you see at carnivals and fairs, or maybe like Six Flags? One of those ones that you have to pay to try to get to the top and it's spinning and everybody falls off. It's like one of the games that's at carnivals. But if you ring the bell at the end, you get a stuffed animal. It looked exactly like one of those. And it was held into the ground on our side by one singular spike, and it was held to the ground on the other side of the river by another singular spike. I want to make it clear, it was only held down by one. You need to understand that. But it's not like this ladder was flimsy. It was very taut, like it could hold your weight. But if you put too much weight on either side, the ladder would flip. Like when we walked up to it and we touched it, you could tell it was very tight. It had a little bit of a bounce to it. But if you even slightly lost balance while you were on this thing, it was going to spin and you were getting dumped in the river. So we found it. This must be the game. We need to get across this rigged ladder and then we could go through the next gap. So Bobby started to brief us on what he thought we should do. The plan was for Heidi to go across first and we hold the step that's closest to us on our side of the river steady so she has a better chance to get across. And then one of us would go second, whoever we thought had a lower chance of making it. And the way we would attempt to cross this ladder is to go down into like an animal style bear crawl stance, and when you take a step, you would move your left leg and your right hand at the same time, and then your right leg and left hand at the same time, so you could keep a counterbalance the entire way across. So I asked Bobby, how confident are you that you can get across? And he was pretty confident he could do it, but he was not confident in his swimming if he fell in. I was also pretty confident that I could get across, but I was even more confident that if I got more than halfway across the river and I fell in, I would still be able to get to the edge, because I'm not a crazy strong swimmer, but I feel like I could do it, even if the rapid is crazy. The river was pretty wide, but I felt like if I got halfway across, I'd be okay, but I could tell that Bobby was genuinely scared of the water and he didn't think he would be. And for me, I felt like I would perform better mentally if I saw both of them on the other side safe. And that way I could fully focus on my balance, because I wouldn't be able to focus if I was thinking about like, he's gonna go after me, I might have to jump into the water after him anyway if he falls in. But if they're both safe, I could just focus on the task at hand. So we decided to go Heidi, Bobby, then me last. So we held the ladder as steady as possible and we attempted to coach her as she went across. And we realized pretty quickly that every slight movement caused this thing to shake. There was no easy way across this, and the smallest mistake, a hand an inch out of place, was going to send you into these rapids. I could tell by the fourth step that Heidi was doing pretty well, but this was even more of a core workout than it was a balancing act, and she was clearly struggling to maintain the bear crawling position. But even when her movements started to get slightly sloppier, she was still making progress. But right as the group's confidence was building, right when she was about 2 steps from the end of the ladder, this girl started to shake like a baby deer on ice skates, and her arms started giving out, everything was going wrong, and just like that, she capsized and she was in the river. We all agreed as a unit to not jump in right away if somebody fell in. We gave her 2 or 3 seconds to show us that her head was above water. And when her head broke the surface and she was able to breathe, she didn't look terrified. It was more of a look of surprise. And luckily, she was close to the other end. Even though the river was drifting her at a very high speed, it was clear she was going to make it to the edge, and she did. And she crawled out of the river and she quickly made her way back to the ladder, because now she was going to hold the other end as steady as possible from her side as well. This way, Bobby would have the best chance of getting across, because I would be holding it on my end and Heidi would be holding it on her end. And I kind of liked the idea that the ladder was going to be sturdier the closer that I got to the end, because clearly Heidi started to fatigue towards the end, and if somebody was on the other side waiting for her, keeping it steady, she probably wouldn't have fallen. So Heidi and I grab both ends and Bobby starts his journey across. He wasn't going super fast, but he was moving confidently, and it didn't look like he was going to fatigue in the same way that Heidi did. But even though it was going well, that same wave of anxiety that I had hit me while Bobby was doing it, and I didn't realize what it was at first. I was internally freaking out, trying to put a finger on what was wrong. And what I realized was, once Bobby reached the end of the ladder and took a step onto the other side of the river, was that from my perspective, Bobby only had one shadow now, and I watched the other shadow wash away into the river as he got to the other side. It was as if once he crossed that line, his second shadow couldn't come with him. And these rapids were so loud that I couldn't communicate with them what I was concerned about. And frankly, I didn't know what I should be concerned about, because losing a second shadow that you shouldn't have should be a relief. But in the pit of my stomach, I knew that it wasn't a good sign. But I had no choice but to start my journey across this ladder. So I put on both of my hands and both of my feet and I sink my weight as low as I can. And one calculated step at a time, I start making my way across this rapid. And I'm really hoping that them holding it on the other side is going to make the second half of this easier, because this first half was fatiguing every inch of my body. And it definitely didn't help that I was borderline hyperventilating, crippled with fear over the fact that I still had 2 shadows. And even though I was trying desperately to focus on the task at hand, I couldn't help but look off to my left at my shadow. And the reason I was looking at the one to my left was because it looked like it was slightly darker than the one to my right. And even though I was in this situation where I should have been hyper focused on getting across, I couldn't get my mind off this shadow. And my lapse of focus resulted in the ladder flipping when I was about 3/4 of the way across. I was anticipating falling in, so I had thought about it. I thought the best thing that you could do is just hang on to the ladder. Like, even if you're in the water, I feel like it's better to hold onto the ladder and just use it as a rope. And I could tell that Heidi attempted to do it as well, but the riptide was too strong for her grip, and she wasn't able to hold on, so she had to rely on swimming. But as I felt the ladder tipping, I let my hands go through the ladder and I wrapped my legs around it like a figure 4, and I held the rope and the steps with both hands, just hugging it. And it went through my head when I tipped over, I was like, I should have done this from the start, because even with my back in the water, the riptide wasn't too strong. I was going to be able to army crawl my way to the other side fairly easily. But what I wasn't anticipating was for something to reach around my waist like it was hugging me from the back, and attempt to yank me into the river. It felt like 2 arms grabbing around my waist trying to pull me into the water. And with the force that it was pulling me down, it brought me a couple inches deeper into the water, which significantly increased the force that the river had on me. I knew I was going to be able to hold onto the ladder, but there was no way I was going to be able to alternate hands and legs to move forward. I was holding on for dear life, and now when waves would pass over me, my face would go underwater, and it would interrupt my breathing significantly. And I tried to look down at my waist to see what had a hold of me, and what I saw was two completely pitch black arms with thumbs and fingers tightly wrapped around my waist, and the source of these arms was coming from the water off to my right. Since I had flipped over, my left had become my right, and that overwhelming sense of dread that I had about my shadow didn't have anything to do with my anxiety. It had to do with my instincts, telling me that I had a predator attached to me since I woke up. The black shadow had turned into a gelatinous cloud of black ink that was now mimicking the shape of my arms and hands, and was attempting to drag me into this rapid and drown me. I was holding onto the ladder for my life, and I was doing my best to breathe in between the waves of water that were hitting my face. I had to really focus on that, not fighting off the hands. I didn't want to start coughing up water and panicking. Internally, I was hoping that this thing would get tired, and I felt like since I had my arms and my legs wrapped around the ladder, this thing probably wouldn't have the leverage to keep pulling on me for a very long time. I thought there would have to come a point where it would have to try a different tactic, and when it changed its tactic, when it made a different move, when it took pressure off me, that's when I was going to make my move. I only had to get about 5 more feet, and then I would be able to reach Bobby and Heidi's hands. They were already reaching over the water, signaling to me that I just had to get close and they would be able to drag me out. So I'm hanging there waiting for my opportunity with my cheekbone pressed against a step of the ladder, and I'm focusing on staying as sturdy as possible while maintaining as much of my stamina as possible. And in that moment of pure survival focus, I'm staring at the step that's pressed against my cheekbone, and I see this engraving on the step of the ladder. It was one of those moments that felt like it lasted an eternity, because you're borderline dissociating from the pain and fatigue that you're feeling in your limbs, so you catch yourself hyper fixating on details that you would never notice. And the engravings on this step had 3 numbers on it. 383. I didn't know what it meant, and honestly, I didn't really care what it meant, but it was something for me to lock my eyes onto and focus. So those 3 numbers were just stuck into my head, 383. And as I was holding myself there surviving, I realized that I was right. This thing did not have unlimited stamina, and I had way better leverage than it did. I was sure in that moment that if I fell into the water, I would not stand a chance. And that was based on the force that it was able to generate with 0 leverage. But eventually I could feel the force of its pull becoming weaker, and I could sense that it was just about to try something different. And what it did was, it attempted to target my legs. It attempted to peel my feet out of their figure 4 position around the ladder, which was a smart move because that's definitely where most of my leverage was coming from. But the mistake that it made was the fact that I was crunched into a little ball. So when it focused on my legs, I was able to climb my arms about 3 steps further. And once my arms were reached up overhead 3 steps further and I had a firm grip on the ladder, I eased up on the grip that my legs had for a fraction of a second, and I yanked myself back up into a ball. But I was 3 steps further. I basically did like a pull-up. Like, imagine how a caterpillar walks, how it scrunches up, then extends, and scrunches up and extends. That's what I did to this thing. I didn't let go of any of the leverage that I had. I just slowly shimmied up like a caterpillar until Bobby and Heidi were able to reach me. I would stay in a full defensive position while it still had a grasp on me. But when it tried something different and I wouldn't feel it tugging, I would extend, then I would bend in that moment that it didn't have me, and I would be closer to the edge, closer to safety. And it finally got fed up with me winning, and when I got to my last extension, it wrapped its limbs around my face and pulled my head completely underwater. It grabbed me from my forehead and my chin, so it had a very good leverage point to extend me backwards. No matter how much I tried to tuck my chin, it was still able to pull it back. And this is when panic set in for me, because I knew I was close to Bobby and Heidi on the other side, but I didn't know how close, and my head was underwater and my nose was filling with water, and my arms and legs were fatiguing, and I thought I was finished when I felt a second set of hands grab my shoulders. And I remember thinking, if Bobby's shadow came back and there's 2 of these things, I might as well let go right now because I don't stand a chance. I don't have enough energy left. Because this second set of hands felt so much stronger than the first set, and they immediately pulled me off this ladder. I did not stand a chance. But these hands didn't drag me to the bottom of this rapid. They were Bobby's hands and they dragged me to shore. And once my head and torso were out of the water, I watched the shadow make its last effort trying to drag me back in. And when it missed and I was out of its range, I watched it surrender and drift down the river. I was completely exhausted and coughing up water, but we had no time to sit here. We needed to start discussing our game plan. I did my best to try to gather myself as quickly as possible, and I didn't want to let the others know how genuinely tired I was. There's nothing quite like the fatigue of getting caught in rapid waters or riptides. It's not like I was swimming against it, but doing an isometric hold against the power of a river for minutes at a time was like running a marathon. I felt like a noodle. And I don't know what else to say to the group to break the silence, so I just go, "What was that?" And I asked that even though I knew what it was. I knew that that thing was the ink that I had washed off in the pond the day before, because I remember how it gathered together under the surface of the water and shot off. And somehow that ink had made its way out of the pond and disguised itself as Bobby and I's shadows while we were sleeping, and it waited until we were in the rapids to attempt to drown us. Bobby playfully said in that moment, "She did tell us not to go in the water," gesturing towards Heidi. And this was the first time that I looked at Heidi since I'd been out of the water. And the first thing that I noticed is that she didn't look horrible anymore. She looked full of color and fully rejuvenated. She had fallen into the river, and the river washed off all the ink that was still on her. So I asked her, "What happened when you went in the water? Because you still had ink on you." And she said that the water felt amazing and it felt like it was instantly healing her and nothing tried to pull her in. And she said it was so rejuvenating, it gave her the energy to swim to the side. And she said she felt like she was 100% recovered when she got out of the water, when she was a complete mess, when she even got on the ladder. This tickled my brain in a very weird way, because it hit me that this wasn't just any task or challenge. This one was more like a test. It wasn't like a quiz. It was more like an instant gratification test. It's like it knew we would be covered in ink when we got to the second gap, and the ink felt like it was set on fire the moment we got there. And this gap presented a beautiful oasis of immediate gratification. But if you indulge in that immediate gratification and relief, it then comes back to punish you. But if you waited it out and you fought through the pain until the second body of water, it rewarded you even if you failed the task and fell in the river. It was like this sick lesson about instant gratification versus delayed gratification. And it made me realize that this place was much more complex than it seemed on the surface. Because even though the way that I just worded that about instant gratification versus delayed gratification, it's a good lesson in general, but the way that it was presented was sadistic. This place basically said, "I'm gonna torture you, I'm gonna put you into excruciating pain. Then I'm gonna present you a solution, and if you take the solution, I'm gonna punish you for it." Heidi broke my internal dialogue about the lessons that this place was teaching me by saying that we should probably get moving. And she tried to up the morale of the group by reminding us that this is the last gap that we're entering. And she also reminded us the tip that Dr. Doyle gave her about it. She said, "Keep this in mind, guys. I don't know what this means, but you need to remember, they are not your friends." That wasn't much to go on, but Dr. Doyle was 2 for 2 when it came to tips. And even though I was having my doubts about it before we crossed that river, now I knew that if Dr. Doyle said it, you live by it. So I bring myself to my feet and I asked Bobby if he's okay. I gotta check in with my boy. He wasn't, but he told me he was, and I lied right back to his face. And we both lied to Heidi, and Heidi lied to us. And 3 people collectively on the worst day of their lives pretended to be okay. And in a single file line, we walked through another unnatural gap in an assortment of branches that shouldn't have been there. So I squint and I brace for pain, or at least for something similar to the last gap that we went through. But I felt nothing. This is the 3rd one that we went through, and when I passed through it, I saw nothing. It was like the lights went out, and the only thing that stopped me from freaking out was when I reached forward, Bobby was still there, and we both immediately whispered to Heidi, who was also still there. And I heard Bobby's hand touch her shoulder because he reached forward frantically, almost slapped her, but I knew that all 3 of us were still there. But there was no telling where we were. Like, I'm telling you, we were in the pitch black, and we stopped moving immediately because we couldn't see a thing. But from the few steps that we took, I could tell that we were still outside, and I could tell we were still in some type of forest just based off my feet crunching on the ground. The sound of the raging river behind us completely disappeared, but we weren't sure if we had to keep walking, like this was some type of middle ground, like maybe this gap is longer than the last 2. But we all shuffled together for a couple more minutes, and we realized that this might just be the 3rd gap. This might be the 3rd task, and we have to find the last gap in pitch black darkness. I heard Heidi squeal, and initially I thought it might have been because something touched her, or she might have heard something. Like, I just initially thought something was going wrong, but it was actually a squeal of excitement because she remembered something that she had packed in her goodie bag. She always had something good in there. And I heard her rip the bag open, and I heard her reaching inside of it, and then I heard a flicker of a lighter. And it took a couple flicks, but it eventually turned on. And I'm expecting to see the illuminated faces of my friends to give me some comfort. But in a very similar way, how Heidi looked like she was absorbing sunlight while she still had that black ink on her in the last gap. It seemed like the blackness of wherever we were was absorbing the light that was coming off the flame. We were able to see the flame itself, but no matter how close the flame got to one of our faces or one of our hands or to a tree that we could all feel, it wasn't illuminating anything around it. It looked like a floating flame in an abyss of darkness. So even though it was a great idea, it didn't do us any good. It was useless. We decided to just put it away because it wasn't giving us any light to navigate. We thought maybe it's more of a liability to have it on because maybe there's something here that will be looking for something like that. We have no idea what this challenge is going to be. The only thing that we know is that they're not our friends. And I thought we were walking slowly in the first gap and trying to not build up a sweat, but there's no slower type of walking than walking blind. We were moving at a snail's pace, and that pace slowed down even further when the whispers started. I wasn't sure if it was the wind at first, and I also wasn't sure if I was the only one hearing it. When the first one blew past my ear, I wanted to ignore it. I wanted to brush it off. Like, I didn't hear that. I wanted to think that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I was just scared. But as the second whisper blew past me, I knew it wasn't a coincidence because I recognized the voice. My mother was speaking to me and guiding me. What she said was, "What you're looking for is to your left." And the first thing that I thought was, no chance I'm going left, because Dr. Doyle said they're not our friends. It didn't matter whose voice flew past my ear, I wasn't making any decisions without the entire group's approval. And soon after the first whisper that hit me, I could tell Bobby heard his first whisper, but he heard his wife's voice because he immediately said her name. And the tone of his voice was that of a concerned husband. And he frantically started saying, "She's telling me to go right. Guys, we need to go right." And Heidi said exactly what I was thinking. "Bobby, they're not your friends." And Bobby pushes back. He goes, "We're not talking about a friend. We're talking about my wife." And Heidi repeated herself very sternly, "They are not your friends." And as we continued to walk, different voices came flowing by in the wind. My sisters, my wife's, my childhood friends, and they were all convincing me to walk in different directions. And there was one voice that stood out, and it made me question Dr. Doyle's advice again, because this was the voice of a devil or a demon, or something sinister that definitely didn't have good intentions. It was deep, it was aggressive, it was menacing, it was threatening, and it was whispering to me to go straight. That one definitely wasn't my friend. And I felt the other two flinch when they first heard that voice, very similar to how I flinched when I first heard it. It was jarring. We were going straight the whole time. We had to weave around a tree here and there, but primarily, we went straight this entire time through every gap, so we continued to do that. Up until this point, that's all we had done, and it's worked so far, so why would we change that now? But as we continued to walk straight, that horrible, menacing voice continued to encourage us, and it was saying things like, very good, don't listen to them, listen to me." We were going so slowly that it didn't feel like we needed to stop to talk, but we stopped when that thing said, "That's right, continue walking towards your friend." And that's exactly what Dr. Doyle said not to do. And this thing just referred to itself as our friend. And at that very same moment, we all saw a dull light in the distance. It was slightly off to our left, but we could continue to go straight and we would still be able to pass it. We would be able to investigate it, but we wouldn't have to go off course. So we continued to walk and we continued to ignore the whispers from our friends and our loved ones. But they started to escalate to pleads and begging and lies and insults, anything to get our attention. And when we got closer to this light and I could see what was inside of the light, what was being illuminated in this pitch black darkness, I started to freak out. It was my mom sitting on a small chair in front of a coffee table that had a candle on it. And for some reason, this candle illuminated the area. Our fire didn't work, but hers did. And for some reason, my mom is speaking out into the darkness, and I'm able to hear her voice as a whisper, and the whispers that I'm hearing match how her mouth is moving. But she stopped saying to walk to the left. She started to tell me that she came out here looking for me. She said that I had went missing and she was worried, so she went to where I was going and she saw a hole in the trees. And she said that she walked through it, and then she started to cry, and she said that she's been here since she walked through it and she doesn't know where she is and that she's scared. And she's calling out to me to help her. She says she can't see anything and all she needs is my help, and she wants me to come over to save her. When she said that she had also seen the circle in the trees and that she had come to save me and look for me, my heart completely broke. Just the thought of my mother wandering through the same thing that we had walked through, but finding herself in this intense darkness and not knowing what else to do but to sit in front of this candle. My instincts almost took over, and I almost ran over to her to grab her and tell her she's going to be okay and add her to our pack and she's going to come out with us. We're going to get out of this together. But Heidi grabbed my shirt and sternly said, "They are not your friends." And immediately after she said that to me, the horrible, menacing voice whispered in my ear again, and it said, "Do what you're told and walk straight." Nothing in me wanted to listen to that voice, but we continued to walk. And once I got some distance from my mother, who was sitting in this dark abyss, I looked back at her and she had her head leaning back, and she was swaying side to side, leaning back, smiling as if she was completely comfortable and content with where she was. Her body language did not match the words that she was whispering to me, so I knew it wasn't her. I didn't leave my real mom behind. And I knew at that moment, it didn't matter who we passed. It didn't matter who we saw here. Nothing was going to take us off course. We were just going to move forward. Because if I was willing to walk past my mother, they had to be willing to walk past anybody. And we walked past dozens of people. We walked past some people that I recognized, people that were attached to me, but then we walked past other people that I knew were attached to the others. Some of my favorite people in the world sitting in total darkness, whispering into the wind, trying to convince us to get off course. And even though it felt like we shouldn't be interacting with these people because they're not our friends, our North Star, this demon voice, felt like an even worse thing to listen to. And as we continue to walk, the whispers start flooding in more frequently and more aggressively, to the point where we couldn't even communicate with each other. We couldn't hear each other. I couldn't hear anything outside of the whirlwind of all of the people in my life pleading with me to go a different direction, followed by a low, horrifying, raspy voice telling me to stay on course. Good boy. Move forward. And once the voices knew that we were not going to listen to them, the things that would start to appear, the things that would be illuminated in the darkness, instead of somebody just sitting on a chair, they became much more violent, much more gruesome. They weren't violent towards us, they were violent towards each other. And whatever these things were, they were trying to convince us that one of our loved ones were in real danger. They were acting out horrible scenes in groups together, but they were switching out which one was the victim. They were attempting to get one of us to spring into action to try to save the person that they were mutilating. But every time we walked past one of these graphic scenes, Heidi repeated herself. They are not your friends. And we had to tune out the sounds of our loved ones screaming, their bones cracking, their flesh tearing. And right after Heidi would scream it, "They're not your friends," the voice would back her up, making it feel like avoiding these things was the wrong decision every time, until in the distance, we could see 3 gaps directly ahead of us, and each gap was illuminated in a very similar way to how our loved ones were illuminated, and they were all lined up next to each other as if they were presented to us as a choice. And next to each gap was another one of those signs that we couldn't tell what it said until we got all the way up in front of them. So here we are, still not able to see each other, still only able to feel each other's garments in our hands because we're tightly squeezing as close as we can to each other, and we're presented with a choice of 3 gaps that were completely identical, and identical to the ones that we had passed through previously. And from left to right, they're labeled home, hell, village. And Bobby immediately broke the silence by saying, "We need to talk this through before we choose one." And I could see that all 3 gaps were already open, like we passed this task. The game here was to choose which one, because I could see the slight sheen of light in the middle of each one of them. And Heidi reminded us in that moment that Dr. Doyle told her that he had went through home, and Dr. Doyle was still alive. He made it out. So obviously in my head, we're gonna choose the one that's labeled home. But Heidi is like, no, we have to go through the one that says the village, because if he went through home and it brought him back to the village, then if we go through the village, it should actually take us home. But for Bobby and I, going back to the village was pretty much us going back home. We wanted to go where we came from. Like, it's not like this gap is gonna drop me in front of my house. The most convenient thing for us is to go back to the village. But Heidi reluctantly pleaded to us that we didn't understand what this place was yet. And she's telling us that she can't go back to the village, but the voice that we'd been hearing this whole time, that demonic voice, spoke over her by saying, "Go through hell." So here's the predicament. This terrifying voice has been telling us to go in the correct direction this entire time. So why would it start lying now? But it's very possible that it was trying to build trust with us all the way through so it could lie now, and we would listen to it and go through hell. And in this situation, I firmly believe Dr. Doyle's rule. They are not your friends. It doesn't matter if this voice was pointing us in the right direction. Nothing out here is our friend. That's why he said the statement broadly. He didn't say, your friends are going to be out there trying to convince you to go off course. He said, they are not your friends, which means everything in here is not your friend, and we cannot trust it. And I expressed that thought to Bobby and Heidi, and they agreed with my logic. As twisted and upside down as this place was, it still didn't feel like the right choice to go through the hell gap. And if Dr. Doyle went through the home gap and it brought him back to the village, that's the one that Bobby and I were going through, because we knew for sure that it got him somewhere safe. And even if Heidi disagreed with us, at this point, we were willing to split up. Like, we helped each other. We got through this. If the village gap took her home, that would be fantastic. But Bobby and I were not willing to go through an untested gap. And as we're all talking, it's as if the voice was listening, and it reassured us that we were all allowed to choose whichever one we wanted. We could all go through different ones. For a moment, it felt like it might have been lying. But then I felt like it was this voice's last-ditch effort to try to get at least one person to go through the hell gap, because we were leaning towards the two that weren't the hell gap. Heidi made it extremely clear that she was going to go through the village gap in an attempt to go home. And we told her that that was okay. And she gave us her blessing for us to go through the home gap to go back to the village. And we let go of our grips from each other for the first time since we entered this third gap. We said our goodbyes without even being able to see each other's faces. She walked through her gap, and Bobby and I walked through ours. And exactly what Dr. Doyle said it was going to be, we re-entered the village. We walked right back through the gap that we initially came through. We were safe, we were totally okay, and we weren't left wondering where Heidi ended up, because she was right in front of us, back in the village, with pure terror on her face. We were happy to be back. She was devastated. The home gap and the village gap brought us back to the village, so she might have needed to go through hell to go home. But now here she was, back in a village filled with people who were physically abusing her when we found her. And all of the people of the village are coming out of the woodwork with shock on their faces that all three of us had returned. And I lock eyes with Dr. Doyle, and I have some questions for him. I told you guys stories this year were going to be different, and I'm excited to share the second half of this story with you. Thank you for your patience, but you guys told me you wanted the stories longer. You wanted them scarier. You wanted them darker. Guess what? Us too.